The forest floor began pulsing under my boots long before I realized something was wrong. I had been walking for hours, the hum of cicadas and the distant cry of a hawk filling the air, the sun low and amber through the pines. I had taken this route dozens of times, patrolling the eastern edge of the national forest, keeping campers and hikers safe, and yet that evening, the forest felt like a living thing, watching me. My name is Thomas. I'm 34, a park ranger in a stretch of wilderness that most people only read about in pamphlets or hear about in warnings from locals. I've been a ranger for 10 years, and I thought I understood these woods, how the trees breathed, how the wind carried secrets, how the river could lull you into thinking you were alone. That night, I realized I understood nothing at all. I had just left the ranger station after a long shift. The small town bordering the forest was quiet, the diners closed, the streets dimly lit. I usually walked alone through this section after dark, checking for stranded hikers or illegal camping fires, but that night I carried an unease that didn't belong to the forest itself. Something in the air felt wrong, thicker, almost viscous, like the scent of rain trapped in moss. My boots sank slightly into the softened earth, and I could feel it pulsing, subtle, rhythmic, but unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the exhaustion of long hours in the sun, but the pattern persisted, syncing with my heartbeat until I began to question whether I was walking or being guided. The first encounter didn't even seem real at the time. I heard the rustle before I saw it, a movement in the underbrush, sharp and deliberate, not like a deer or a fox. I stopped, hand on my flashlight, listening. The snapping of twigs came again, but this time from multiple directions. I called out, my voice steady, professional, though my stomach twisted. "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. The wind seemed to halt, the usual whisper of leaves vanished, replaced by a silence that pressed into my chest. Then a shadow flitted between the trees, larger than any animal I had seen in these parts. My rational mind screamed bear, but the movement was upright, almost human, yet too large. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself I was tired, but I didn't move forward. I didn't retreat. I just stood there, listening to the forest breathe around me, trying to convince myself that reason could save me. As I continued on, the unease grew. Sounds that had once comforted me, the creak of pine branches, the chatter of distant wildlife, became grotesque and distorted. A crow's caw repeated in my mind, echoing behind the trees like an omen. The forest floor itself seemed to shiver. I could feel the roots pressing against my boots as if the earth beneath me was alive. My radio crackled faintly, an almost inaudible whisper of static, but no one was on the channel. I told myself it was interference. I told myself to ignore it. Rational thought became harder. My instincts screaming warnings I was too proud to heed. I had walked these trails in the dead of night before, alone. I had always relied on my training, my knowledge. That night, both failed me. The second incident came at the creek. I was checking the area for campers, flashlights sweeping over the smooth rocks and dark water. That's when I saw it. Two eyes reflecting my beam, far too high off the ground for any deer, animal, or human. I froze. The water lapped quietly, betraying nothing. The eyes disappeared, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But the air grew colder, damp with mist, and I could hear the water bubbling behind me, though I was nowhere near it. Then, from the shadows of the trees came a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a human cry. It wasn't anger, it wasn't a normal threat, but it carried intelligence, malice, almost a warning. I stepped back and the underbrush crackled as if something enormous was moving parallel to me, matching my pace, staying just out of sight. My hands trembled, my flashlight shaking. I remembered every survival protocol I had ever learned, every story of creatures in the wilderness, and yet none of it prepared me for the realization that I was not alone. The forest began to manipulate my senses. I could feel eyes on me even when I couldn't see anything. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and the wind seemed to carry whispers, phrases half-formed in no language I knew. I tried to speak to them, joking aloud, calling the forest a cruel trickster, but the silence answered with intensity. Every instinct told me to leave, but my pride as a ranger, my sense of responsibility to the woods and its visitors, anchored me in place. I walked carefully, scanning for footprints, strange marks on trees, anything I could rationally explain. I found none, only the pulsing under my boots. Later, I encountered the cave. It was a small opening near the ridge, known to locals as the Hollow Cave. Stories abounded, mostly dismissible myths of wild men or spirits that haunted the area, but as I approached, I felt something different, something urgent. The ground before the cave entrance trembled subtly under my boots, not like an earthquake, but like the pulse of a living heart. The air inside was warmer than the surrounding forest, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. I debated turning back, but the pull of curiosity, the part of me that had always pushed to know what lurked beyond the known, was irresistible. I stepped inside. Darkness swallowed me immediately, the beam of my flashlight reduced to a trembling cone. I felt the pulse intensify, like the heartbeat of the forest itself syncing with mine, and I realized in horror that it was not the forest alone. Something else was there, something massive. It did not attack, at least not at first. It observed. Every sense I had honed over 10 years of ranger work screamed at me to flee, but I remained frozen. My rational mind tried to catalog what I saw, but the cave's darkness was absolute, swallowing sound and light alike. Then a low, resonant exhale came from the shadows, a breath so deep it rattled the stones. I caught a glimpse. Massive, covered in hair, taller than any human, limbs long and powerful. The eyes glimmered for a moment in my light, and I felt the forest pulse faster, synchronizing with something ancient and alive. A creature older than any story, older than any ranger protocol. Fear rooted me to the spot, and for the first time, I understood what it meant to be truly insignificant, utterly unprepared. I retreated slowly, never turning my back, listening to the sound of my own pulse mingling with the creature's breath. When I finally emerged, the forest seemed to exhale with me. The oppressive tension momentarily lifted, though I knew it would return. That night, as I sat in the ranger station, notebook in hand, I realized the forest had tested me, pushing me to the limits of fear and reason. Every rustle, every shadow, every whisper forced me to confront my own arrogance, my assumption that I could control or predict the unknown. I wrote down every detail, every sensory impression, knowing it might seem unbelievable to anyone else. But for me, the lesson was clear. The forest was not just a collection of trees and trails. It was a living, sentient adversary, patient, observant, capable of bending perception and testing the soul. The experiences multiplied over the following weeks. I encountered footprints too large for any human, fur caught in branches that didn't match any local wildlife, guttural calls echoing through valleys at night. Each event escalated in intensity, forcing me to confront a recurring psychological dilemma. The conflict between my duty to the forest and my instinct for self-preservation. I rationalized. I argued with myself. I told myself it was animal or wind or shadow, but the evidence became undeniable. The forest had a memory. It had guardians, and it had the power to make even the most seasoned ranger doubt everything he knew. I began to notice small changes in myself, hyper-awareness, hesitation, a weight on my chest as I patrolled. Every snap of a twig, every creak of bark, every shadow carried the potential for revelation or terror. I was learning a critical lesson, that fear is not just an obstacle, it is a teacher. It forces attention, sharpens perception, and challenges the ego that assumes knowledge is safety. And I realized something else. Survival was not about conquering the forest or its creatures, but about understanding my own limitations and respecting the power of the unknown. And so I continue, walking the trails, boots pressing against that pulsing floor, flashlight in hand, every nerve alive. The forest has become both my mentor and my mirror, reflecting my fears, my pride, my resilience. I cannot claim to have tamed it, and I do not pretend to understand all that moves within it. But I have learned to listen, to observe, to respect the rhythm of life and death, the fragile balance between the natural and the supernatural. Every encounter with shadows, every whisper in the wind, every pulse beneath my feet is a reminder that fear is not the absence of courage. It is its accompaniment, its companion, its test. I know now that the forest will never be fully mapped, never fully explained, never fully controlled. And perhaps that is the lesson I carry forward. For myself and for every camper, every hiker, every soul who dares to step beyond the known paths, fear will meet you in whispers and in shadows, in footsteps that do not belong. But it is through facing it, through walking the pulsing floor with awareness and humility, that we discover the depth of our own courage and the fragile, luminous beauty of the world we inhabit. The nights became longer, though the sun still rose in the east and dipped behind the western ridges. Time felt distorted in the forest after that first encounter. I began noticing patterns, rhythms in the wilderness that were never there before. Or perhaps I had never seen them. Shadows that stretched unnaturally, sounds that repeated at intervals too precise to be chance. Even during daylight, the forest seemed alive with intent, pressing against my skin in a way that was subtle but insistent. I could feel it watching, cataloging, judging my every step. The pulsing under my boots had become constant, like a heartbeat that did not belong to me, and it seemed to anticipate my movements. One evening, I was checking a trail along the ridge where hikers had reported strange lights at night. I had my flashlight, my radio, and my rifle, but I didn't feel armed. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth, and as I walked, the ground beneath me shifted ever so slightly, like the pulse had intensified, moving in waves through the soil. Then I heard it, a low rhythmic thumping, echoing in the trees. At first, I thought a woodpecker, but the cadence was wrong, too deliberate, too heavy. It was coming closer, following me, yet there was no movement in my peripheral vision, no leaves rustling. I stopped, listened, and the thumping ceased. The silence that followed was more deafening than any sound. I felt a presence behind me, enormous, patient. The instinct to run wrestled with the need to remain composed. I trained myself to assess threats logically, but my logic faltered. I turned slowly, flashlight sweeping over empty air, yet I felt the weight of something massive, something alive, just beyond sight. My pulse quickened, not just from fear, but from recognition. Whatever was here was not merely an animal. It was something older, something that belonged to the forest in ways I could not hope to comprehend. My heart matched the pulsing beneath my boots, and I realized with a jolt that I could not tell where I ended and the forest began. That night, I returned to the ranger station, notebook in hand, jotting down every detail. The townsfolk didn't notice my state, too wrapped up in their daily routines. But inside me, the forest's rhythm had taken hold. Sleep was impossible. Even in the quiet of my small cabin, I could feel the pulse in the floorboards beneath me. Dreams were vivid, dark, filled with shapes moving just out of reach, voices that were half-formed, urgent, pleading. I woke drenched in sweat, unable to distinguish the night from the day. I told myself I was overworked, that my mind had become a prism, refracting normal forest sounds into fear. But the scratches on the trees, the massive footprints along the ridge, and the odd tufts of hair in places no animal should reach told me otherwise. Weeks passed, and the forest continued to test me. One morning, while checking a remote campsite near the creek, I saw them. Small, fleeting glimpses of figures in the trees. At first, I assumed hikers had ventured in illegally, but the shapes moved with a silent coordination that no human group could achieve. Their limbs elongated unnaturally, disappearing into the dense foliage before I could get a clear look. The birds went silent. The creek stopped flowing. I realized then that the forest itself could manipulate its sounds, its movements, to keep its secrets. And somewhere behind the shapes, I felt the pulse again, stronger, synchronized, alive, waiting. The cave called to me again. Despite my fear, I returned, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread. The entrance was no different than before, yet the air smelled of decay and iron, tinged with something undefinable, ancient, patient, and alive. Inside, the pulse was unmistakable, thrumming through the stone floor, vibrating through my boots and into my chest. I pressed forward, every step measured, every breath controlled. Yet the shadows seemed to shift as I moved. I heard whispers then, not words, but tones, patterns that resonated in my mind. The forest was speaking, and though I could not understand it, I felt the meaning. You are not alone. You are being watched. You are being tested. Then I saw it, partially, emerging from the darkness. The creature was taller than any man, covered in thick, matted hair, its eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. It moved with a deliberate grace, silent, and yet its presence was impossible to ignore. I could feel its gaze pressing into me, weighing me, measuring me. Fear rippled through my body, raw and primal, yet beneath it a strange respect began to form. This was not mindless aggression. This was intelligence, ancient and patient, and it seemed to acknowledge my courage, my persistence, my willingness to step into the unknown without retreating in panic. I learned then that fear could become a teacher. Each encounter forced me to assess not just the forest and its creatures, but my own mind, my own resilience. The pulse beneath my boots became a rhythm of life, a reminder of the fragile boundary between control and surrender. I began to listen to the wind, to the water, to the underbrush, to the whispers that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. I learned patience, the power of observation, and the humility to accept that the forest could never be fully understood. One night, the forest tested me more directly. A storm rolled in, winds lashing the treetops, lightning illuminating the canopy in jagged flashes. I was patrolling the ridge when I heard it, a deep, resonant roar that shook the ground beneath me. The pulse intensified, synchronized with the creature's presence, vibrating through the soil, through my bones. I ran, boots sinking into mud, rain stinging my face, flashlight beam cutting through the downpour. The roar followed, echoings, reverberating, yet never catching up. When I reached the relative safety of a rocky outcrop, I realized the creature had no intention of harming me. Yet the fear it instilled was enough to strip away any illusions of mastery I had once held over the forest. The following days were a blur of observation, reflection, and careful patrol. I noticed changes in the forest's usual patterns. Trees bent subtly towards certain paths, water flowed differently, shadows stretched unnaturally. Each anomaly reinforced the lesson. The forest was alive with intention, and its guardians, whatever they were patient, unseen, and deliberate. I began to feel a kinship with the pulse beneath my boots, an awareness that fear and respect were intertwined, and that survival depended not on domination, but on understanding, on humility. Then came the night that changed everything. I had returned to the cave, flashlight in hand, rain dampening my jacket, heart pounding with both anticipation and dread. I stepped inside, and the pulse greeted me like an old friend, vibrating in rhythm with my own heartbeat. The shadows moved differently this time, shifting with awareness, almost curiosity. And then I saw them. Several figures, massive, hair covering with silent precision. Their eyes glimmered with intelligence, and for the first time I felt neither fear nor the instinct to flee. Instead, I felt awe, a deep understanding that this forest, these creatures, were older and wiser than I could ever hope to be. I had been tested, challenged, and found willing to listen. I left the cave that night transformed. My fear had not vanished, but it had evolved. The forest no longer pressed against me with malice. It pulsed with recognition, respect, and a warning. Walk carefully, live consciously, honor the unknown. I patrolled the woods differently after that, more observant, more aware, carrying not just my flashlight and rifle, but a heightened sense of the invisible, the unheard, the alive. I understood finally that the forest was not an enemy, nor were its creatures. They were teachers, guardians, and reminders that the world was larger, older, and more mysterious than my human mind could fully grasp. And yet the pulse beneath my boots remains constant, a heartbeat that binds me to the forest, to its secrets, to the lessons of fear and respect. Each patrol is an exercise in humility and courage, a negotiation between what is seen and what is sensed, between control and surrender. I walk the trails not as a master, not as a conqueror, but as a student, attuned to every vibration, every shadow, every whisper. The forest will always hold its secrets, but I have learned that fear, when embraced and understood, can illuminate the path, teach resilience, and reveal the profound beauty of the unknown. Ah, I understand exactly what you mean. You want the story to flow naturally, not forced into a rigid three-part structure. The number of sections should emerge organically from the narrative, not from some mechanical rule. Some stories might need 4, 5, 6 sections, depending on tension, pacing, and escalation. I'll write the next section as a natural continuation, letting the fear build and the psychological tension deepen without worrying about any default, so this number of parts. Here's the next immersive section of the story, picking up seamlessly. The nights after that encounter became something I can barely describe without feeling the pulse again, even now. The forest had begun to infiltrate my dreams. I would wake in the ranger cabin, convinced I was standing in a grove I didn't recognize, hearing the low, resonant breaths of those enormous shapes echoing through the darkness. Sometimes I'd awaken to find scratches on the doorframe, wet mud on the floor, or tufts of fur that I knew could not have come from any bear or wolf. My colleagues joked about my overactive imagination, but I saw it in the trees, in the way the shadows moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. One evening, I was patrolling near the northern ridge, where the forest opens into a plateau dotted with rocks and scrub pines. The sun had dipped low, leaving the world washed in bruised violet. The wind carried whispers, at first faint, indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves, but gradually forming syllables I could almost understand, like a language trying to slip into my mind. My pulse quickened, not the rhythm of my heart alone, but that deep subterranean thrum beneath my boots, vibrating through the soles of my feet, up into my chest. I stopped, frozen, listening to the rhythm. It seemed to call to me, not threateningly, but insistently, like a summons I could not ignore. I followed it. I don't know why. Logic screamed retreat. My instincts begged me to leave. And yet, some deeper part of me, the part that had always sought the edge of understanding, pushed forward. The trees thickened, their trunks gnarled and twisted, blackened in places where fire had once licked the forest floor. The shadows here were unnatural, bending in ways that should have been impossible, and the pulse grew stronger, faster, pressing into me, guiding me. Then I saw it, a faint glow, low and warm, like the light of embers beneath the roots of a fallen tree. The creature emerged from the shadows this time without hiding. Its massive form towered over the scrub pines, limbs long and powerful, movements deliberate and measured. It did not roar or attack, but I could feel its awareness, its intelligence, its curiosity. I raised my flashlight cautiously, trying to capture a clear look, and our eyes met. There was something in that gaze, a recognition of me as a creature of the forest as well, a guardian, a participant in the unspoken laws of this place. My fear did not vanish, but it changed, becoming an acute awareness, a reverence for the raw, alien power before me. I retreated slowly, never breaking eye contact, listening as the pulse beneath my boots synchronized with the creature's rhythm. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. The forest's fear is not malevolent. It is a test. It is a gauge of respect, patience, and humility. It strips away the illusions of control that humans cling to and forces a confrontation with the unknown. I had thought my training, my years as a ranger, made me safe. It didn't. What made me safe, in a sense, was my willingness to acknowledge fear, to let it guide me, rather than blind me. Later, back at the ranger station, I reflected on every detail. The forest had become more than a workplace. It was a teacher. Every encounter forced me to confront my limitations, my pride, and my assumptions about reality. Each shadow, each sound, each pulse beneath my boots was a lesson in vigilance and humility. I began recording these observations in painstaking detail, knowing that one day someone might read them and scoff. But I also knew that the forest does not reveal itself fully to all who seek it. It is selective, patient, dangerous, and beautiful in ways that defy explanation. One stormy night, I decided to patrol the southern trail where hikers had reported hearing growls like a human in pain. The wind lashed through the trees, whipping rain into my jacket and making visibility nearly impossible. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, illuminating branches twisted by the storm. And then I heard it, a deep, resonant voice that was neither fully human nor animal, chanting in a low, steady rhythm. My pulse quickened, matching the vibrations under my boots. Every fiber of my being screamed to flee, yet I could not. Something compelled me forward, a need to understand, to witness, to survive the encounter on its own terms. The forest seemed to fold around me, bending space and sound. I could feel the ground shift subtly beneath each step, as though the forest itself were alive and aware of my movement. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I caught glimpses of enormous shapes moving through the rain. Limbs too long, bodies too massive for any human, moving with precision and awareness. I realized then that this forest was not only alive, but inhabited by entities that had observed humanity for far longer than we could imagine. And though fear gripped me, I felt a strange exhilaration, the knowledge that I had stepped into something ancient, something profound, and lived to witness it. The experience changed how I walked the woods. Fear became a tool rather than an enemy. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, every pulse beneath my boots became a signal, a guide, a teacher. I learned to move quietly, observe keenly, and trust the subtle rhythms of the forest rather than my assumptions. I began to anticipate patterns, understand signals, respect the invisible rules that govern these woods. Each encounter left its mark, a psychological fingerprint that both haunted me and strengthened me. And yet, the greatest lesson was still to come. One late evening, deep in the hollow ridge, I found myself standing at the mouth of the cave again. I had learned its rhythm, its pulse, and I approached not with bravado, but with attentiveness and respect. The air was thick, warm, and smelled of earth and decay. The pulse thrummed strongly, almost like a heartbeat I could feel in my own chest. And then I saw them. A group, tall, covered in thick hair, moving silently within the shadows. Their eyes gleamed with intelligence, and for a moment I felt the weight of history itself, pressing down, observing, judging. I did not raise my flashlight, did not call out. I simply stood, feeling the pulse, feeling their presence, and allowing myself to exist within the forest's awareness. And then something extraordinary happened. The pulse shifted, slowed, and became a gentle rhythm, no longer threatening but acknowledging. I realized that I had been accepted, not as a conqueror, but as a witness, as a participant in a story far larger than my own. Fear had guided me to understanding, respect had earned me recognition, and the forest had revealed a fragment of its secret without violence, without malice, but with undeniable power. I left the cave that night profoundly changed. I knew that the forest would always hold its mysteries, that fear would always lurk beneath every shadow and whisper. But I also knew that by embracing fear, observing carefully, and respecting the rhythms of the unknown, I could navigate it with awareness and courage. The pulse beneath my boots, the eyes in the shadows, the whispers in the wind, they were no longer simply threats. They were teachers, guides, reminders that the world is far larger and stranger than we dare to imagine. I continue to walk these trails, boots pressing against that pulsing floor, flashlight in hand, heart attuned to every rhythm, every vibration, every shadow. I carry the lessons of fear, respect, and humility into every patrol, every encounter, every silent night in the forest. I know now that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to walk into it, to observe, to learn, and to return, forever changed. The nights grew colder as winter edged into the forest, and the pulse beneath my boots became more insistent, more insatiable. It was no longer just a warning or a presence. I felt it in my bones, a heartbeat of the forest itself, ancient, unyielding, alive. Every patrol became a negotiation with the unknown. I learned to trust the rhythm, to follow it, and to anticipate its shifts. Yet with every step, the tension grew. I could feel eyes tracking me from the shadows, and in the silence, I often imagined shapes that weren't there, or perhaps shapes that refused to reveal themselves. One evening, I followed a narrow game trail that led deep into the northern hollow. The air was thick, humid, and smelled of damp leaves and old wood. The light of my flashlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, and the forest seemed to fold inward, enclosing me in its quiet, predatory embrace. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, low and deliberate, moving parallel to my path. My pulse matched the rhythm under my boots, faster now, urgent. I stopped, listening, and the scraping halted. A breath of wind stirred the branches, carrying the faint, metallic scent of iron. I turned slowly, expecting nothing, and yet I felt it. The presence of something enormous, patient, intelligent, observing me with unwavering attention. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself it was a bear, a tree falling, a trick of sound. My training screamed logic, yet my instincts whispered truth. I was being watched by something beyond my understanding. I took a cautious step forward, and the pulse beneath my boots intensified, synchronized with the movement I could not see. Then I heard a low exhale, resonant and deliberate, like the forest itself had released a breath. The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged, towering, matted with fur, limbs impossibly long. Its eyes met mine, glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight, and for the first time, I did not feel fear in the conventional sense. I felt awe. I felt respect. I felt the humbling weight of something far older than humanity, patient, observant, testing me, challenging me to confront my own mortality and arrogance. I realized that the forest and its guardians were not malevolent. They were judges of presence, of attention, of humility. My survival depended not on weapons, on bravado, or on knowledge, but on perception, patience, and reverence. Every instinct I had honed in 10 years as a ranger now guided me, but in ways I had never imagined. I was no longer just a man in the woods. I was part of a living, breathing system of ancient rhythms, and every heartbeat beneath my boots was a lesson in survival, awareness, and respect. The creature stepped closer, though I could not tell if it was approaching me or merely shifting its position. I could hear its breath, deep and resonant, echoing in the hollow, vibrating through the roots and soil. I remained still, mind focused, senses sharpened to every detail. The scent of moss and iron, the subtle movements of leaves in the windless air, the faint vibration of the pulse beneath me. And then the unimaginable happened. It exhaled again, and the pulse slowed, softened, no longer urgent or threatening, but almost communicative. It was acknowledging me, not as prey, not as an intruder, but as a witness, a participant in the story of this forest, however small and fleeting my presence might be. I do not know how long I stood there. Seconds may have stretched into hours. When I finally stepped backward, the creature receded into the shadows, leaving the forest alive with its rhythm, but no longer oppressive. I realized I had survived a test far beyond my comprehension. The fear that had driven me to vigilance, that had sharpened every sense, had led me here, to understanding, to recognition, to humility. I had walked into the unknown and returned not defeated, but enlightened, forever changed. In the weeks that followed, I patrolled with a new awareness. Fear had become a companion, a teacher, a guide rather than a threat. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind, every subtle shift in the forest's pulse reminded me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk with it, to learn from it, and to respect what we cannot control. I began documenting everything, the strange tracks, the distorted sounds, the rhythm of the forest itself, not for anyone else's validation, but as a personal record, a map of encounters and lessons that could not be fully conveyed with words alone. The forest floor still pulses beneath my boots, a constant reminder of that living, breathing world that surrounds and envelops us. I have learned that our understanding of nature, of reality, of what lies beyond the obvious is fragile. We are never as in control as we believe. The forest, with its guardians, its rhythms, its whispers, teaches patience, humility, and courage. It demands that we confront our own limitations and fears, and in doing so, discover a depth of resilience we may not have known we possessed. Sometimes, when I walk alone on a quiet trail, I feel that pulse intensify, not threateningly, but as a reminder that I am alive, that I am present, that I am part of something larger than myself. Fear has taught me to observe, to respect, to live consciously. The forest is not mine to conquer, nor its creatures mine to fear. It is a realm of lessons, shadows, and rhythms, and we are fortunate to witness even a fragment of its truth. And so I walk, boots pressing into the pulsing earth, senses attuned to every whisper and shadow, heart open to fear and awe alike. The forest tests all who enter it, and not all pass, but those who listen, who learn, who respect, find themselves changed, more aware, more humble, more alive. I am one of them, and I will continue to walk these trails, not as a master of the forest, but as a student of its rhythms, a witness to its mysteries, and a guardian of its secrets. The pulse never ceases. It is a reminder, a teacher, a companion. And as I step forward into darkness and shadow, I know that courage is not about defeating fear. It is about walking with it, listening, observing, and carrying its lessons with every step. The forest floor continues to pulse beneath my boots, and I walk, ever watchful, ever respectful, ever aware that the unknown is not the enemy, but the ultimate teacher. I'm only recording this because I can't trust my own memory anymore. Some mornings, I wake up with the taste of pine needles between my teeth, like I've been chewing the forest in my sleep. Other mornings, there's mud under my nails, so fresh it's still wet. And on nights when the wind turns warm for no reason, someone knocks on my cabin door even though I live 40 miles from the nearest paved road. But none of that compares to the fog. The first time I saw it move against the wind, I thought it was exhaustion, and maybe it was. Back then, I was still pretending there were explanations, weather anomalies, optical illusions, stress. Rangers cling to rationality the way drowning men cling to driftwood. We don't let our minds run wild, even when the wilderness begs us to. My name doesn't matter, but I've spent 23 years as a ranger in the Northern Rockies, first as a volunteer, then as a seasonal hire, and eventually full-time law enforcement. If you've spent enough time out here, you've seen things you don't talk about. But what happened to me wasn't just something I witnessed. It followed me. It whispers in the tree line at dawn. It presses its weight against my ribs when I sleep. And it began with a disappearance I still can't explain without feeling sick. Her name was Katie Morrow. 27, solo backpacker, experienced enough not to do anything stupid. She signed in at the visitor station at 8:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, her pack was sitting upright on the bank of Coldwater Creek like someone had placed it there for a photograph. Every strap buckled, food sealed, bear spray untouched. She might as well have stepped out of existence mid-stride. I was the one who found it. And I was the one who convinced her parents that maybe she slipped crossing one of the footbridges, maybe she got disoriented, maybe she panicked and ran. I fed them every rational possibility I could think of, even while the back of my neck burned with the sense that something had been watching me from the tree line as I spoke. They thanked me. They believed me. I didn't believe myself. I still see her pack in my sleep, sitting perfectly upright. Too perfect. Like the forest was presenting it to me. After that search, something shifted inside me. I stopped entering the forest casually. I stopped trusting the rustle of leaves or the shape of shadows. And when the wind picked up, I listened closely, too closely. That's when the dreams started, if they were dreams. In one of them, Katie stood at the foot of my bed. Not a ghost, not decomposed or glowing or grotesque, just standing. Dry clothes. No pack, no wounds. Her hair hung neatly over her shoulders like she'd just walked out of a warm hotel shower. She stared at me with this fixed, unblinking expression. And the worst part wasn't her silence. The worst part was that she kept breathing, slow and quiet, like she was trying not to wake me. I never saw her face clearly. Every time I try to remember, her features blur, like wet paint smudged under a thumb. but I remember her lips moving. I remember her whispering something so faint I couldn't hear, though the room was still as death. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping like someone had been pressing on my chest. That was 3 days before the fog came. It was early October. Mornings had started freezing, but the afternoons were still warm enough to melt everything into thick, wet air. Temperature swings create all kinds of fog banks, especially around the lakes. But this fog didn't behave like anything I've seen in 2 decades of fieldwork. I was patrolling near Old Survey Road, a decommissioned route that once serviced a mining site back in the 40s. The government sealed the tunnels decades ago. Unstable structures, methane pockets, old unexploded charges. Officially, nobody goes near them. Unofficially, rangers hear noises from those tunnels all the time, echoes that shouldn't exist. Metal clanging even though the entrances are welded shut. Sometimes, this one always gets me, footsteps deep inside the mountain. Human footsteps, paced and rhythmic, like someone waiting for a door to open. That morning, I heard something new, something like someone dragging their fingers across the inside of a metal wall. A slow scrape, 5 distinct tracks, a full hand. I killed the engine and stepped out of the truck. The scrape stopped immediately, like it knew I'd arrived. The forest felt colder than it should. The kind of cold that sinks into bone instead of skin. Steam rose from my breath even though the sun was already up, but the ground was warm. I felt it through my boots, a faint vibration like something shifting deep under the soil. That's when I noticed the fog. It wasn't rolling in. It was already standing there in the trees, still and tall and unnaturally dense. It formed a wall, no, a shape, a column, about 8 feet high, perfectly vertical. Not drifting, not swirling, waiting. I walked toward it slowly, radio silent except for the faint static behind the dispatcher's voice. The static grew louder the closer I got, whining in my ear like a mosquito. I tapped the radio, thinking it was interference from the old mining charges buried under the ridge. But the static didn't sound electronic. It sounded wet. Organic. I stopped about 20 feet from the fog column. I swear it leaned, not in a way wind would push, more like someone shifting slightly to get a better look. A slow tilt, forward and down, as if studying me. My heartbeat grew so loud I felt it in my throat. My hands went cold and sweaty at the same time. I whispered, "Hello?" The fog shivered, not dispersing, contracting, drawing inward like breath. Then it slid sideways against the wind, gliding with a motion that didn't match the air currents at all. You know how birds adjust their wings to stay stable in a gust? This fog did something like that, except it didn't have wings, or mass, or anything natural holding it together. I stepped back, hand instinctively hovering over my holster, even though bullets don't do shit against weather. The forest went silent. Not quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, no creek, no wind. Even my radio cut to dead air, though I could see the signal light flickering. When the fog moved again, it didn't drift. It jerked. A quick snap like a glitch in a video. One moment it was 15 feet away, the next it was 10. I stumbled back so hard I nearly tripped over a cedar root. My vision narrowed. My mouth went dry. Something brushed my ankle. Light, cold, like a fingertip dragged across skin. I bolted. I didn't run blind. I knew the terrain, but fear made every step louder than it should have been. Branches snapped underfoot. My breath came in ragged bursts. The forest chased me, not with sound or movement, but with presence, like the trees were leaning inward as I passed, closing off the sky. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. Slamming the door didn't make me feel safer. The fog stopped at the tree line, like it was respecting a boundary or waiting for me to cross it again. I watched it through the windshield for at least 90 seconds. It didn't disappear. It simply thinned into the air, dissolving without dispersing, as if it chose to leave. When I finally started the truck, my radio crackled back to life mid-sentence. "You copy? Ranger Hale. Do you copy? Who's that breathing?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because for those 90 seconds, even inside the truck, I wasn't alone. I could still feel it, something cold pressing against my chest, compressing the breath from my lungs like invisible fingers. I thought that was the worst of it. But the fog came back. And the second time, it spoke. I didn't tell anyone about the fog. Rangers report poachers, missing persons, fires, illegal camping, the occasional meth lab in a rusted-out camper, but not fog that moves like a living thing. Not fog that watches you. Besides, there was already talk among the staff that I hadn't been myself since Katie disappeared. They didn't say it to my face, but I'd heard them whisper in the break room. Words like burnout, trauma, overworked, losing grip. Maybe they were right. But the second time the fog came, it stripped away any hope that what I'd seen was stress or misinterpretation or just wilderness weirdness. The second time, the fog made a sound, not natural, not wind, a voice. It happened 4 nights after the encounter on Survey Road. I couldn't sleep, hadn't been sleeping much since the dreams of Katie started returning. I'd wake up gasping, with the sheets tangled in my fists like I'd been clawing at something, or someone. This night, I wasn't asleep at all when it began. I was sitting in the cabin kitchen, staring into a cup of cold coffee that smelled faintly like iron. It was 2:14 a.m. I remember the exact time because the minute hand stopped moving. The clock didn't tick, didn't whir. It just froze. I tapped it. Nothing. My phone screen wouldn't turn on either. No response. Dead, even though I'd charged it earlier. That's when the cabin temperature dropped so fast my breath hit the air in a thick burst, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The floorboards vibrated under my bare feet, not shaking, pulsing, in slow, measured beats, like a heartbeat in the ground. The windows began to fog up from the inside, even though the cabin was already freezing. Thick condensation smeared across the glass in patterns that didn't drip downward. They crawled sideways, upward, spiraling. I stood, pulse hammering in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight on instinct, though the beam flickered like the batteries were dying. Outside, the night was too quiet, too empty. When I stepped onto the porch, the forest was washed in a pale, blue-white glow. Not moonlight, too bright, too directionless. It looked like the trees were lit from within, as if the trunks were hollow and something luminous pulsed inside them. And then I saw the fog. Not a column this time. A line. A thin, vertical strip of dense, unmoving mist standing between the first 2 pines beyond my yard. Perfectly straight, like a curtain pulled taut. Every hair on the back of my neck rose. My throat tightened, because this time it wasn't watching. It was waiting. The forest's cold breath pressed against my skin. My boots crunched on frost that hadn't been there minutes earlier. I approached the fog slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam touched the mist, but didn't illuminate it. The light bent around it, swallowing the beam like a hole in the air. Then the fog spoke. Not loudly, not clearly. It whispered. But it whispered in Katie's voice. "Ranger Hale, help me." My knees nearly buckled. My vision blurred at the edges. I swallowed hard enough to hurt. "No," I whispered. "No, that's not." The fog shivered. A ripple. A slow undulation that crawled along its rectangular form like something shifting an outer layer of skin. "Ranger Hale," it said again, clearer this time. Not exact, not perfect, but close enough to crack something inside my chest. "Please." The flashlight fell from my hand. I stepped backward instinctively, boots scraping against the frost. Everything in me screamed not to answer, not to engage. But guilt has a gravity of its own. "Where are you?" I whispered. The fog stretched. It didn't move outward naturally. It elongated like something inside it was extending a limb. A suggestion of an arm pushed through the mist. Not a solid one, an outline, trembling, wavering between forms. Human for a second, then something too long, too jointed. My breath froze. Katie had been 5'4" at most. This shape towered over me. Its hand ended inches from my chest, fingers tapering into dissolving points. "Come," it whispered. Not Katie's voice anymore. Not human. Just a mimicry wearing her tone like a mask. I stumbled backward so fast I slipped on the frost. My shoulders smacked the porch step. Pain shot fire up my spine. I scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me hard enough to rattle the frame. Silence fell instantly. No whisper, no cold, no vibration. When I finally worked up the nerve to look out the window, the fog was gone. Not faded, not drifting away, gone as if it had never been there. But the frost remained. And on the porch rail where the fog's hand had hovered, 5 thin lines of condensation streaked downward, like the impression of fingers dragged along wood. I barely slept for the next 72 hours. Every creak in the cabin felt like footsteps, every gust of wind sounded like breathing, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that elongated silhouette, stretching for me with a hand that wasn't a hand, whispering with a voice the fog did not own. I tried to rationalize it, tried to think of temperature inversions, auditory pareidolia, stress hallucinations, even carbon monoxide. I checked the cabin's detector twice, perfectly functional, no leaks, no explanations. But something in the forest had used her voice, something that remembered it, and whatever it was, it didn't need sleep. It didn't need warmth. It didn't need breath. It only needed me to listen. 4 days later, a call came in. A hiker had gone missing. A man named Daniel Cruz, 41, experienced, healthy, meticulous. He'd radioed his wife at 6 p.m. to say he was setting up camp. By morning, when she tried to reach him, his GPS signal was still pinging the same spot, but he never answered. I was assigned primary responder. I didn't want to go. I'd never admit that out loud, but my hands shook the entire drive to the trailhead. I kept checking the mirrors, convinced the fog would appear in the road behind me. When I reached the parking area, Daniel's car was still there, a dusty, mud-splattered Subaru. Nothing unusual. What was unusual were the footprints leading into the forest. Not one set. 3. One belonged to Daniel. Strong heel, wide stride. The second set, I can't explain. Barefoot. Narrow. Too narrow. The toes pointed forward except the smallest one, which pointed slightly outward like it had been broken long ago and never healed right. The third set wasn't a footprint at all, more like a dragging shape. A long, smooth indentation that carved a shallow groove into the damp soil, as if something heavy and shapeless had been pulled along behind them. I crouched and touched the groove. The soil was still warm. Something flickered in the tree line. White, vertical, thin as a ribbon of mist. Fog. Watching. The temperature around me dipped instantly. A sharp, needle-like cold that slid between the layers of my uniform. My breath steamed. My heart raced so hard it felt bruised. I stepped back, pulse roaring in my ears. The fog slipped behind the trees, not moving with the wind, moving with intention. I knew then I wasn't dealing with weather or hallucination. Something in those woods followed people, something that learned their voices, something that could mimic their calls for help. I forced myself to continue tracking. Duty. Habit. Obligation. Call it whatever you want. I walked deeper into the trees because I'd been trained to follow trails, not fear. But the deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. Birdsong cut off mid-note. Branches overhead stopped swaying even though the wind hadn't died down. The smell changed too. A faint odor first, one I thought might be a dead animal, then stronger. Sulfur. Wet fur. Burnt hair. Rot. A blend of smells that had no business being in the same place but hit in waves, as if something had walked through multiple states of decay. I gripped my radio, thumb hovering over transmit. That's when I heard the whisper, not behind me, directly beside my left ear. Ranger Hale, come. I spun so hard I lost balance. Nothing was there, just trees, just silence, just the faint hiss of fog forming deeper between the trunks. Something was leading me, not guiding, luring. And for the first time in my career, I realized I was prey. I forced myself to breathe slowly, even though the air felt like it was thickening around me, pressing against my ribs. The radio at my shoulder buzzed faintly, static rising and falling like something breathing through the speaker. The signal shouldn't have been failing. I wasn't far enough into the forest for dead zones. But the static kept shaping itself into something rhythmic, almost syllabic. I turned the volume down. It didn't help. The whispers didn't stop. They just shifted to the trees around me. Come back. The voice didn't match Daniel or Katie. It was smaller, younger, fragile, a child's voice. I hadn't had a child go missing in this sector in years. I would have known. But the forest remembers voices. Sometimes I swear it keeps them. The footprints ahead deepened, like Daniel had started running. The bare, narrow ones stayed perfectly aligned, pace matching his in a steady, unnatural rhythm, and the dragging groove beside them deepened too, cutting into the earth, pushing leaves away like a plow blade. The deeper I followed, the more the smell thickened. Wet fur, metallic blood, that sharp ammonia scent that clings to decomposing tissue, something animal, something wrong. The fog wasn't behind me anymore. It was ahead. Thin, twisting strands drifted between the trunks like veins of smoke from an invisible fire. They clung low to the ground, curling and uncoiling in slow pulses. When the wind shifted, the fog didn't. It defied the movement, swaying in the opposite direction with a slow, almost deliberate grace. My throat tightened. Then I heard a sound I'll never forget, the cracking of branches. Not snapping from weight, bending, groaning. Like the forest itself was shifting its posture. I looked up, and for a split second I saw the tops of the pines tilt inward, bending in a long, slow arc, as though they were trying to look at me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a fallen branch. That's when the first scream cut through the woods. It wasn't Daniel. It was something raw, primal, and full of terror. The kind of scream that doesn't come from a startled animal or a man calling for help. It was the scream of someone realizing they were already dead. I gripped my radio and forced my voice steady. Dispatch, I need backup at Sector 7, Trail Marker 8. Possible critical. Static swallowed my words. A heavy, suffocating wall of it. Then, underneath the static, the same scream echoed through the speaker, the exact same scream I'd just heard in the trees. I dropped the radio. For a moment I thought about going back to the truck, calling for help, admitting I was in over my head. But Daniel could still be alive. That's what I told myself. That's what kept my boots moving forward even when every instinct screamed to leave. The footprints turned sharply downhill toward a ravine. Not a steep drop, but rough enough terrain to break a leg or ankle. Daniel's tracks faltered here, staggering left, then right, as though he'd been dragged or disoriented. The bare tracks stayed controlled, stepping precisely where the soil was firmest. And the dragging indentation? It deepened, as if whatever made it was growing heavier. I followed the trail to the ravine edge. The smell hit me first, blood and cold water and something else. Something metallic and hot, like burnt wiring. My eyes watered. That's when I saw movement below. Not a person, not an animal, a shape. Long, pale, shifting between forms as it writhed in the fog. I froze, breath caught in my throat. At first, the shape looked like a person hunched over something. Then, as the fog rolled back slightly, it straightened. Too tall, limbs too long, spine arched in a way that made my stomach twist. Daniel lay sprawled against a boulder at the bottom of the ravine. His pack was torn open beside him, gear scattered across the moss. His face was turned toward me, eyes wide. Wide in a way no living person's eyes look. But his chest moved. Shallow, weak, alive. "Daniel," I shouted before I could stop myself. The shape snapped its head toward me. I didn't see its face, just the blur of shifting colors, like skin trying to decide which form to wear. A ripple passed along its limbs, and the fog around it drew inward, thickening as though sucked toward the thing's chest. Then it made a sound. A hiss? A whisper? A moan? No. Words. It spoke. "Come back." The same child's voice from earlier, the same tone, same wavering cadence. My legs turned to stone. That voice, it didn't match the body. It didn't match anything the shape resembled. It was like a recording playing through an unfamiliar speaker. The creature, or mist, or whatever it was, moved toward Daniel, shifting between postures with unnatural, glitching speed. Forward 1 second, closer the next. Not walking, appearing. Daniel coughed weakly, and his voice rose in a ragged rasp. "Help me!" But the voice that echoed his words from the ravine's far edge wasn't his. It wasn't even close. It was the fog, mimicking him off-beat like a broken radio. "Help me!" The imitation was wrong. Too slow. Too low. As if repeating the phrase after hearing it for the first time. My rational mind couldn't keep up. Every explanation failed. Animal mimicry? Impossible. Speaker malfunction? What speaker? Gas hallucination? Not like this. Not with the fog watching me. I drew my pistol. Useless or not, it was all I had. The shape twisted toward me, stretching unnaturally. Its limbs unfolded like an insect forced into human posture. The fog thickened around its legs, unless those were its legs. I couldn't tell where the creature ended and the mist began. Daniel let out a choked gasp, his hand lifted weakly, pointing toward me, or past me. Then he whispered, "Behind you." I spun. Fog, a thick vertical mass inches from my back. It hadn't been there seconds ago. Something cold brushed the nape of my neck, not a gust, pressure, fingers. 5 distinct points of contact. I jerked away, stumbling, sliding down the slope. Rocks tore at my uniform. My shoulders slammed into the mud at the bottom. I crawled to Daniel, grabbing under his arms. "We're getting out," I muttered, even though my voice was shaking so hard I barely recognized it. He didn't respond, but his breathing quickened. The shape moved, soundlessly, effortlessly. It didn't lunge, it just appeared closer, its form blurring through the fog. The bare narrow footprints I'd seen earlier matched its shifting legs as they struck the ground in perfect, unnatural precision. I dragged Daniel toward a fallen log, planting my feet in the soaked earth. His eyes fluttered open. "They sound like her," he whispered. My blood froze. "Who?" "The fog." His voice cracked. "They sound like my daughter." A noise rose behind us. Not a scream, not a growl, a moan. A layered, many-throated moan made of overlapping voices, adult, child, male, female. All out of sync. All wrong. The fog thickened behind us, and the creature shifted, bending forward in a way the human skeleton isn't meant to allow. Its face, if that's what it was, turned toward me. I didn't see features. I saw movement, churning, skin sliding, muscle reforming, a face trying masks, trying every one, trying mine. My breath stopped. The fog whispered in my exact voice, "Come back." My grip on Daniel tightened. My vision darkened at the edges. I wasn't looking at a creature. I was looking at a mirror, trying to remember what it had seen me do. The fog surged. Daniel convulsed. I raised my pistol, and the ground beneath us opened. Not a crack. A tunnel. An entrance I swear hadn't existed seconds earlier. A mouth in the earth yawning wide, and we slid into the dark. The fall wasn't far, but it felt endless. Daniel slipped from my grasp the moment the ground gave out beneath us. My flashlight, still clipped to my belt, smashed against something hard as we tumbled. The beam spun wildly, cutting frantic slices of light through the dark. I hit an incline, rolled hard, then dropped again. Dirt filled my mouth, my nose. Something sharp scraped the side of my face. My shoulder cracked against stone. Then, silence. The kind of silence that suggests you've fallen somewhere no sound is meant to reach. I lay there, gasping, every nerve screaming. My ears buzzed with a dull ringing. My chest ached like someone had punched the breath out of me. When I tried to move my left arm, pain shot all the way to my collarbone. Maybe sprained, maybe cracked. Hard to tell. The flashlight beam finally steadied. I was lying in a narrow tunnel. The walls weren't raw earth, they were smooth. Too smooth. Like something had carved this space deliberately. Not miners, not tools. Something else. The air tasted metallic, and underneath that metallic taste, decay. The smell clung to my throat, thick and wet, like rotting leaves soaked in stagnant water. I swallowed, gagging. "Daniel." My voice echoed strangely, bouncing off the tunnel walls in a way that distorted my own tone. Too many echoes. Too many layers. I forced myself upright, using the tunnel wall for support. My legs shook, my vision blurred. I dragged the flashlight beam across the ground. A smear of blood led deeper into the tunnel. Fresh. Bright. Daniel's pack lay torn a few feet away, straps shredded as if pulled apart by hands or something mimicking hands. "Daniel," I called again, louder. The tunnel answered. Not with my voice, with his. "Over here." But it didn't sound right. The real Daniel had a tired, middle-aged rasp. This voice was smoother, younger. It sounded like someone imitating him from memory, an old memory, incomplete. Still, I moved toward it. The tunnel sloped downward, curving slightly left, then sharply right, as if following some instinctive architecture. The walls were damp. My fingers brushed something cold and slick, like residue. I didn't want to think about what kind of residue. My boots sank into mud here and there, but the floor was mostly compacted earth and stone, walkable if uneven. The flashlight flickered each time I passed an outcropping of darker stone. Static crawled up the handle of the light. Not electrical, vibrational, like it was reacting to something in the walls. That's when the whisper came again. "Ranger Hale." Daniel's voice, no, something wearing it. "Daniel, answer me," I shouted, my own voice cracking through the darkness. Silence. Then faintly, too faintly to be real, "Help." Me. Not ahead. Behind. I spun, flashlight trembling in my hand. The tunnel behind me was empty. The air shifted, subtle but intentional. A soft brush of cold grazed the back of my neck. The same 5-point pattern I'd felt before. Fingers. Invisible. Reaching. I lurched forward, nearly falling to my knees. The tunnel narrowed until I had to crouch to continue. My breath fogged the air in front of me, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. The fog formed strange shapes, ripples, faces, silhouettes that dissolved when I blinked. At the end of that cramped passage, the tunnel opened abruptly into a cavern that couldn't possibly exist under this ridge. The ceiling arched high above me, coated in thin, web-like strands of white mineral deposits. They glistened faintly in the flashlight beam, trembling as if reacting to my presence. And the floor, my God. The floor was covered in patterns, not carvings, footprints, thousands of them. Barefoot prints of all sizes, adult, child, some small enough to be infants, all pressed into the earth, overlapping, spiraling outward from the center of the cavern like a giant whirlpool. Every single one pointed inward, toward a shallow pit. And in that pit, Daniel. He was alive, barely. His chest rose and fell unevenly. His shirt was soaked with blood, some his, some not. His leg bent wrong at the knee, twisted back at an angle no joint should allow. But his eyes were open, and he was staring up at the cavern ceiling, unblinking, shaking like he was freezing. "Daniel," I whispered, stepping closer. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out." His eyes rolled toward me slowly. Too slowly, like his gaze had to travel through something thick. "I didn't follow it," he rasped. I knelt beside him, ignoring the pain shooting through my arm. "Don't talk. Save your strength." His hand shot up and clamped around my wrist with surprising force. "No," he hissed. "You don't understand." His voice wasn't Daniel's anymore. It was layered. 2 or 3 tones blended unnaturally beneath his words, like something else was speaking through him. Something deeper. Something older. It followed me. His grip tightened. My bones ground together under his fingers. Daniel's face contorted, not in pain, but in panic. Mesmerized panic, the kind where the mind is collapsing in on itself. "It thinks I'm someone else," he whispered. "It thinks we all are." Before I could speak, the cavern filled with a sound that paralyzed every muscle in my body. Breathing, from above. A long, drawn-out inhalation that pulled air downward like a vacuum. The strands along the ceiling quivered inward. Dust spiraled up from the floor. Even my breath hitched, sucked forward toward the roof of the cavern. Then the exhalation came. Slow, heavy, wet. And the fog began seeping from cracks in the ceiling, thin tendrils sliding downward like living threads. They dangled like puppet strings, descending toward us one by one. Daniel let go of my wrist. "Don't let it touch you," he whispered. My flashlight flickered wildly, then steadied. I aimed it upward. The fog strands pulled back from the light as if the beam physically pushed them away. But the cavern's ceiling, it wasn't stone. It was something else beneath the mineral layer. Something pale, something porous, something that pulsed faintly in the beam. Not stone, not bone. Something between the two. I staggered back. Daniel shuddered violently, legs kicking weakly. "It wants," he rasped, coughing blood. "A face." My blood went cold. "What?" "A face," he choked out. "It becomes what we think we see." Before I could ask anything else, a shape emerged at the far edge of the cavern, a vertical column of fog, rising smooth and straight from the ground. Another to the left, another behind it. One by one, they manifested in a slow circling pattern around us, silent sentinels forming a perimeter. Each one leaned slightly forward, all watching. My flashlight beam dimmed again. A faint vibration hummed through the handle, not failing, resisting. Daniel coughed, eyes darting wildly. It's choosing which one of us to copy." His voice broke on the last word. Blood dripped from his lips. "We need to move," I said, grabbing him under the arms. He screamed when I lifted him, an awful animal sound, nothing human left in it. I didn't have a choice. I hauled him toward the cavern edge, lungs burning, arm throbbing. The fog columns shivered. One of them stepped, not drifted, stepped, a long, unnatural stride forward, as if testing how to mimic the act of walking. Its form twisted with each motion, glitching like a corrupted video frame. Daniel whimpered. "We're dead," he rasped. "We're leaving," I said through clenched teeth. I don't know where the strength came from. I dragged him another 5 feet. My boots scraped over the footprints pressed into the dirt. The fog to our left extended a limb. Fog shouldn't have limbs. This one did. A long-reaching suggestion of an arm forming out of a thickening patch of mist, stretching, contorting, taking shape slowly as if it were learning anatomy in real time. The hand at the end of that limb had too many fingers, not 5, 7. All of them tapered to fine, dissolving points. They reached for Daniel's face. He screamed again, a raw, dust-breaking sound that echoed off every surface in the cavern. I raised the flashlight and aimed the beam directly at the reaching limb. The fog recoiled instantly, hissing, not quietly, loud, like steam bursting from a ruptured pipe. The cavern quaked. The strands over our heads rippled violently, and from somewhere deep in the earth came a groaning sound, like a door being forced open from the wrong side. Daniel clutched my jacket weakly. "It's waking up," he whispered. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that something below us was shifting, something massive, something alive, and the fog was its breath. Daniel's words rattled through my skull long after he'd fallen silent. "It's waking up." The cavern floor trembled beneath us, slow, rhythmic pulses like the beating of something buried deep below. The entire chamber felt alive, breathing, listening, looking. I tightened my grip around Daniel's upper body and dragged him another few steps toward the far wall, aiming the flashlight at the fog limb still recoiling from the beam. The moment the light shifted off it, the limb began to reform, slowly, deliberately, like melting wax pulling itself upright. Another fog column straightened, then another, shapes emerging, testing their movements, observing mine. They weren't drifting anymore. They were approaching. The ceiling shook with a low, resonant moan. Dust rained down in thin streams. One of the pale, porous sections above us flexed inward slightly, as though something massive was pressing its weight from the other side, trying to break through the mineral crust. A thin crack split the ceiling. A single drop of dark fluid fell. It hit the ground with a faint hiss, smoking slightly. I didn't wait to see a second drop. "We're leaving," I growled through clenched teeth, sweat freezing on my back despite the heat blooming in the cavern. "Daniel, stay awake. I need you awake." His head lolled against my arm, eyes glassy. For a moment, I thought he was gone, but then his fingers twitched. "They took her," he whispered, voice drifting, hollow. "My daughter. They took her voice first." I froze. "What?" Daniel's lips trembled. Tears, dark, thin, almost black in this light, streamed down his temples. "It learned how she cried," he rasped. "It kept calling me with it. I thought she was alive somewhere down here." His breath hitched. It wasn't her. It was never her. The fog nearest us shivered, reacting to his voice, like it remembered the sound, like it liked the sound. The nearest column of mist elongated, forming a half face, eyes too large, a mouth stretching too wide. Not finished, not perfect, but attempting to be human. Attempting to wear someone. Daniel's scream tore loose before he could stop it. The cavern trembled again, stronger. A deep rumble rolled through the stone. The crack in the ceiling widened another inch. I didn't have time to ask questions. I pulled Daniel again, but the ground shifted beneath us. Not an earthquake, something moving under the floor. A ripple of raised earth traveled beneath the layer of footprints, like something crawling just under the surface, pushing upward. The ripples moved fast, circling the pit, converging toward us. The fog columns leaned in unison. Daniel sobbed quietly. I knew then he wasn't going to walk out of here. His leg was mangled, his ribs probably shattered, his mind hanging by threads. He had minutes at best. but minutes were enough. The cavern wall to our right wasn't solid stone. It had a narrow gap near the floor, half collapsed. If I could wedge us through, I flashed the beam across it. The light pushed the fog back, but the moment it swept away, the mist columns surged forward again, stretching limbs in our direction like starving shapes reaching for warmth. I took a breath, braced for the pain, and dragged Daniel toward the narrow opening. The ground rippled again, closer this time. Something beneath us was rising. The fog columns moved faster, not jerky, not glitching, fluid, learning, anticipating. I slid Daniel to the base of the wall, wedged my shoulder against the rock, and shoved upward. Dirt cascaded over my arm. A slab shifted a hair's breadth. The fog hissed, not at the wall, at me. Then a voice, my voice, whispered from behind, "Don't leave us." I spun. One of the fog columns had taken a more complete form. Tall, narrow, the faint suggestion of limbs, a torso, a neck, and a face, unfinished but trying to match mine. The mouth curved into something like a smile that had never been practiced on an actual body. Cold pressure clenched my chest, 5 points, fingers pressing inward through air. I gasped, staggering. The flashlight slipped from my hand. It clattered to the dirt, beam spinning upward and landing on the unfinished face. The fog recoiled violently, shrieking with a sound like tearing metal. I snatched the light again through sheer reflex. The ground beneath us heaved upward with a sudden, violent jolt. Daniel let out a strangled cry. The crack in the ceiling widened with a sharp snap. The fog columns all turned upward simultaneously. Their movements were no longer curious. They were worshipful. Something above us was descending. A sound rose through the cavern, a slow inhale that dragged loose stones upward from the ground, pulling them toward the ceiling like gravity had reversed. My hair lifted. My clothes tugged upward against my body. The fog shook with excitement. "Ranger," Daniel whispered. His voice sounded like it was coming from far away, deep underwater. "You have to go. I'm not leaving you." His hand clamped around my wrist, weak, trembling, but resolute. "You don't understand," he rasped. "It only needs one of us, the one it calls, the one it's been following." My blood ran cold. "Which one is that?" I whispered. Daniel stared at me with dead certainty. "You," he said. "It wants you." The cavern ceiling bulged inward, stone bending like wet leather. A massive shape, indistinct, fog-shrouded, pressed against the mineral membrane above us. Something like a hand, if hands had too many joints, pressed outward, stretching the thinning layer. I could see the imprint of its long fingers. They dwarfed my entire body. Daniel's grip loosened. His eyes softened. "It'll let me die," he whispered, "but it won't let you go." I shook my head violently. "I'm not leaving you behind, not after what you've—" His voice changed. It wasn't layered anymore. It wasn't fearful. It was pleading. "Please, don't let it become my daughter again." Something cracked deep inside me. I wedged the flashlight into Daniel's shaking hand and turned back to the rock gap. I slammed my shoulder into it again and again and again. Pain tore through my ribs. My vision blurred. The stone finally shifted half an inch. Behind me, fog limbs dragged across the ground, reaching. Daniel screamed, a fragmented, broken sound that ended abruptly as one of the fog columns wrapped around his leg and began pulling him backward across the pit. He clawed at the ground. The fog tightened. "Ranger!" he screamed. Not in fear, but in command. "Go!" I threw my entire weight into the stone. It snapped inward with a sudden gasp of collapsing earth. A narrow tunnel yawned behind it, no bigger than a crawl space. I turned to grab Daniel, but the fog had already engulfed him. It swallowed his torso, his arms, his face. His final scream was cut short, smothered inside the mist. The cavern ceiling split open with a wet, ripping sound. I crawled into the narrow tunnel as the massive shape above the ceiling began to descend. The fog surged after me, reaching, learning, calling my name, in my voice. "Come back." The crawl space narrowed immediately. Too tight, too low, forcing me on my stomach as dirt pressed into my teeth. The flashlight beam jittered wildly, bouncing off stone inches from my face. My shoulders scraped rock. Every breath felt like inhaling grave dust. Behind me, the fog poured into the space like liquid shadow. Cold rushed over my boots first, then ankles, creeping up my legs with the deliberate patience of something certain it would catch me. My own voice echoed behind me too close. Ranger Hale. The tone was wrong, soft, coaxing, stretched like someone pulling each word through water. I clawed forward faster, elbows digging into soil, muscles screaming. My injured arm throbbed like bone shards were grinding together, but I forced it forward anyway. The tunnel sloped upward sharply. Roots and stones tore into my skin. The flashlight flickered with every jolt. The fog whispered again, quieter, "Come back. You dropped something." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't mimicking at random anymore. It was mimicking context. Learning. Adapting. Hunting. The tunnel tightened even more, squeezing my ribs as though the earth itself wanted to crush me. My chest scraped rock. Pebbles dug into my hips. I could barely move my legs. Claustrophobia surged like an electric shock through my skull. Every instinct begged me to turn around, to push backward toward open space, even if that space held nothing but fog. A soft vibration brushed my boot. A fingertip. No, many fingertips. The mist flowed over my heel in a cold wave, groping blindly, finding the fabric of my pant leg curling around it. I kicked violently, scraping my knee raw on the stone. The fog tightened. Not enough to stop me, yet, but enough to let me know it could. My heart exploded in panic. I scrambled forward, shoving dirt aside with trembling fingers, flashlight clenched between my teeth. My breath fogged the air, thick and white. Then, a sound ahead. Air. Faint, stale but unmistakable. An opening. The tunnel widened slightly, just enough for me to drag myself faster. I shoved forward, boots kicking at the fog behind me. The mist hissed. I don't know if fog can feel pain, but this one reacted like it could. I crawled harder, forcing my shoulder past a wedge of rock. Skin tore, warm blood trickled down my forearm. The fog surged faster, enraged. "Come back! Come back! Come back!" The voice was no longer mine, or Daniel's, or Katie's. It was a chorus of all three, layered, fractured, desperate. It filled the crawl space. It pressed against my bones. Then my hand broke through into open air. I dragged myself out of the tunnel, tumbling onto a cold concrete floor. The flashlight flew from my mouth and clattered across the ground, spinning until it cast a weak cone of light on a rusted metal wall. Concrete. Steel. I had crawled into something man-made. A bunker. Unmarked. Unmapped. Impossible. I scrambled backward just as the fog reached the tunnel exit, stretching out in a long, hungry limb that stopped inches from the threshold. It didn't cross. It hovered. Retreated slightly. Then shivered like a frustrated animal scratching at a door it couldn't open. My chest heaved. Each breath stabbed like glass. The fog whispered one last time, soft, intimate, hateful. "We're not done." Then it slipped back into the darkness of the crawl space. Gone, but not gone. Waiting. I didn't move for a long time, couldn't. The bunker smelled like rust and old water. A faint hum vibrated through the floor, distant machinery or the heartbeat of the earth itself. The darkness pressed heavily on the edges of the flashlight beam. The walls were lined with peeling paint and metal shelves full of unmarked containers. My hands shook so violently I had to clench them into fists before I could stand. As I rose, the flashlight beam slid across the far wall, and my breath stopped. There were drawings, dozens, maybe hundreds, scratched into concrete with something sharp, some deep enough to gouge out chunks of wall, some fresh, some decades old. Faces, hundreds of faces, human faces, men, women, children, all drawn in jagged, frantic strokes, all with wide, hollow eyes and stretched mouths. Below each face was a date. Most were recent, some only days apart, some crossed out violently, scratched through so many as the concrete crumbled. At the very bottom of the wall was a final, newer carving, so fresh the dust still clung to the edges. It was a face I recognized instantly. Mine. Below it, Ranger Hale. 6 days my stomach dropped. Something had been tracking me, recording me, waiting for me. I stepped closer, flashlight trembling. That's when I saw the smaller markings between the faces, lines of text scratched in shaky handwriting. Some were nearly gone, some still clear. Together they read like the confessions of dozens of voices. It wore my husband's voice. Don't follow the fog, they come from below. If you hear your name, run. It learns, it remembers. It prefers those who feel guilt. It only needs one face. My throat closed. Footsteps echoed behind me. I spun, flashlight raised. A figure stood at the opposite side of the bunker. A man, Daniel, standing upright, breathing normally, alive. But wrong. Daniel's face was slack, expression neutral, eyes unfocused. He took a slow step toward me, head tilted slightly to the left in a manner no living person would ever naturally do. My voice shook. Daniel? He blinked once, twice. Then his jaw cracked open with a sound like bone splitting. And in a perfect imitation of my voice, he said, "It only needs one face." My blood turned to fire. Daniel took another step forward, jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being tested by novice hands. His skin rippled around the jawline as if something beneath was adjusting its fit. I raised the flashlight, a useless instinct, but the beam struck his face and he flinched, skin shifting beneath the light. The fog had learned. It didn't need mist anymore. It had a body now, Daniel's body. I backed toward the far wall, heart crashing against my ribs. Stay back. The figure tilted its head again, too far this time, vertebrae popping softly. Its smile stretched wider, skin dimpling at the edges, almost splitting. Then it moved, fast, too fast. I dove sideways, shoulder exploding with pain. The creature slammed into the wall where I'd been standing. Concrete cracked inward. Dust filled the air. The flashlight skittered across the floor again, landing near the bunker door. A door. A rusted steel emergency door, ajar by 2 inches. I lunged for it. Behind me, the creature let out a sound I still hear in my sleep, a layered broken roar of all the voices it had ever worn, all trying to scream through one mouth. I grabbed the flashlight, squeezed through the door, and hauled it shut behind me. Something slammed into the metal. Once. Twice. The third impact bent the door inward. I ran. Corridors stretched in every direction, narrow, colorless, endless. No signs, no markings, just cold hallways built for someone who expected never to be found. The lights overhead flickered, the kind of industrial bulbs that hadn't been replaced in decades. Shadows jerked across the walls with every buzz. Behind me, the door hinges screamed. Metal tore. The creature was forcing its way through. I sprinted, ignoring the agony in my ribs, lungs burning, legs shaking. A staircase. I took it 2 at a time, vision swimming, a ladder, upward, a hatch above. I slammed into it with my shoulder. It didn't budge. I threw myself again and again. The metal groaned. Below, the creature's footsteps entered the corridor, slow, deliberate, echoing like someone dragging a corpse behind them. Its breathing filled the hall, not fog anymore, not imitation, something real wearing something stolen. I hit the hatch a final time. It burst open. Night air crashed down on me. Icy, clean, alive. I hauled myself into the forest, rolling onto pine needles. The hatch hung crooked in the ground behind me. A steel door buried under moss and roots, hidden for God knows how long. I scrambled to my feet. The forest was silent. Snow, new snow, drifted gently through the air, even though the forecast had predicted clear skies. Then, a single whisper rose from the hatch. Soft, calm. My voice. We're not done. I ran until my lungs felt like they were tearing. I never returned to that sector. I never told my supervisor the truth. The fog still comes for me. Sometimes outside the cabin, sometimes inside, sometimes in dreams, sometimes wide awake. It doesn't need to chase me. It's learning my face, my voice, my thoughts. It's getting better every night. And I know one night soon, when the wind is still and the fog moves against it, it will finally wear me right. I still remember the exact sound of that scream. Not a human scream. Something cracked and raw, as if the forest itself had learned how to articulate horror. It happened during my first week alone, deep in the Cascades, where the air smells of wet pine and decay even before the snow arrives. I'd been a forest ranger for nearly 8 years at that point. The kind of job you take to escape everything else, thinking you could wrestle order from chaos. But the forest doesn't care about your order. It doesn't negotiate, and it never forgets. My name is Dean Callahan. I wasn't always a ranger. I trained in search and rescue, studied environmental science, spent time in the Marines. I wanted to work somewhere the rules weren't entirely human made. Somewhere you could still feel the weight of the land and know in your bones that it had its own agenda. Most days were quiet: birds, deer, the occasional hunter breaking regulations. But quiet doesn't mean safe. It was the night my lantern died, the first real night alone in the field. I'd been patrolling near one of the older mining trails, the ones locals avoid because things happen there. I never believed in old legends, but superstition runs deep here. Even the dirt smells different once you cross those ridges. That night, I heard a voice, or a dozen voices, calling from the brush below the ridge. I thought it was a hiker or a lost camper. I called back. My voice swallowed instantly. There was no echo, no response, just the cold crawl of silence between words. Then the smell hit me. Burnt hair. Not human, or at least not entirely human. It curled into my nostrils and settled there. My stomach clenched. I tried to rationalize, maybe a car accident in the canyon, maybe an animal. I flicked the lantern, and it sputtered once, then went black. I was alone, surrounded by darkness that pressed closer than any walls ever could. My radio was dead. Cell service is spotty in these parts, but it had been strong enough earlier. Now it was gone. I started walking downhill toward the sound, or what I thought was the sound. My boots sank into snow that wasn't supposed to be there this early in September. Thin layers, icy as glass. Every step felt wrong. Twigs snapped behind me, though I was careful to step lightly. Then I saw it, a silhouette among the trees. No more than a shadow at first, but it moved even though my light was off. The figure didn't run, didn't react, just tilted its head as if examining me, testing my attention. I froze. I remember telling myself, it's someone lost, maybe hallucinating, maybe scared. I've seen that look before, but this wasn't a person. The shape didn't breathe the way humans breathe. It stood too still, limbs too long, body too symmetrical. My mind clung to every rational explanation. Fog, a trick of moonlight, a tree cut weird. Anything besides what it really was. I raised my flashlight again. The beam hit nothing, and yet I could feel it, closer now, shifting like air against the edge of my jacket. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice was small, cracking. I should have left then. Turned back to my truck, but something, a need, a compulsion I'll never understand, made me step forward. That's when I heard it. The voices, clearer now, whispering my name. Dean, Dean, Dean. Not a single voice, but many, layered, each slightly off. The sound came from below the snow, from behind the rocks, from everywhere and nowhere. My heart hammered against my ribs as if trying to escape my chest. I stumbled onto an old, partially collapsed mining tunnel. The mouth yawned like a wound in the mountain. Curiosity overrode caution. I clicked on my flashlight, barely more than a flicker, and stepped inside. The air was thick, metallic, almost alive. I swear I felt something brush my ankle. I spun. Nothing. Only the walls, slick with condensation and age. The whispers grew louder as I walked further, echoing off the stone, mimicking voices of people I've known, family, friends, people I'd buried emotionally, mentally long ago. Then I saw them, footprints, not human, too long, too narrow, toes impossibly thin. And not one trail, they multiplied, overlapped, ran sideways, even doubled back on themselves in ways that made no sense. Panic started to seep in. My rational mind screamed to turn back. Yet I pressed on, telling myself I could map the tunnel, mark it, survive. The whispers changed tone, almost impatient now. I heard laughter, soft, almost amused. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time lost meaning in that tunnel. The air pulsed, each inhalation tasting of iron and ash. My lantern, the backup one in my pack, refused to light. My fingers shook violently. I could hear something breathing ahead of me, but nothing moved when I shined the light forward. Then a hand, or something like a hand, tapped the wall beside me. I didn't see it. I felt it, cold, wet, almost sticky, leaving a heat in its absence that made my skin crawl. That's when I realized the worst part. I wasn't alone in my memory. The forest, the tunnel, the mountain, they were all remembering me. Every regret, every misstep, every disappearance I'd investigated, It followed me. I could hear their whispers. The girl who vanished at Mount Hood, the father who went missing along the Rogue River, my own brother, gone before I joined the service. Each name, each story, twisted, called back to me in tones I couldn't identify as human. I tried to retreat. The tunnel stretched endlessly. The exit disappeared. The snow, the ridge, the trees, they weren't where I left them. Light became abstract, a concept rather than a reality. Shadows moved independent of everything logical. One appeared behind me, then in front. I felt my sanity thinning. I rationalized, always rationalized. It's hypothermia, dehydration, stress, I told myself. You're hallucinating. But the smell of burnt hair, the pressure on my chest, the invisible brushing against my legs, all of it was real. My body knew before my mind could accept. I stumbled into a chamber, a collapsed mine shaft, or perhaps a cave hidden deliberately, a place no human should find. The walls pulsed subtly, as if breathing. Something sat in the center, a mass darker than the darkness, unmoving yet profoundly aware. I froze. My flashlight died, leaving me in absolute black. I could feel it then, not see it, not hear it. Something pressed against the air in front of me, observing, judging. And then I understood, the forest does not protect you, it catalogs you. It stores everything you've touched, every life you've failed to save, every scream you ignored. I fell to my knees. My fingers clawed at the stone, the dust, the walls, trying to anchor myself to reality. But the whispers persisted, louder now, intimate, cruel. Dean, you're next. My own name became a sentence, a verdict. I could see flashes of faces I knew, twisted, grinning at watching me through invisible cracks in the stone. And then I felt the first touch on my shoulder, light, almost questioning, like it wanted me to understand something I couldn't. I don't remember leaving the chamber. I don't remember returning to my truck. But I do remember the way the sky looked when I finally emerged, wrong. The stars rotated backwards, snow falling upward, air thick with static. Shadows stretched and warped around me. Something had followed me, or perhaps I had been allowed to leave. Either way, the forest had made its point. Nothing leaves untouched. I drove in silence for hours, checking the rearview mirror obsessively. Every shadow became a shape. Every glint of light, a pair of eyes. When I finally reached a ranger station, my colleagues noticed nothing. They assumed I'd gotten lost, hypothermic. I lied. I laughed it off. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, what I'd felt. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had learned my patterns. Every morning, I would wake to the whisper of wind that seemed too deliberate, too familiar, threading through the pine needles like it was speaking. I started noticing things that weren't there before, or maybe I just hadn't seen them. Shadows that didn't belong to anything, reflections in streams that didn't match my movements, silhouettes frozen in the brush that vanished the instant I blinked. My colleagues joked about seeing things, but they didn't understand. I wasn't hallucinating yet. I was being cataloged. It started small. A pair of footprints circling my tent overnight, always the same size, always too narrow to be human. I told myself it was a deer, a raccoon, some clever animal. But the prints were too precise, too deliberate, stepping softly, never leaving a trace of fur or claw. Then came the whispers at the edge of my vision, the soft imitation of my own voice, calling out, asking questions I hadn't spoken aloud. One night, I heard someone, or something, laugh in the distance. A laugh that was mine, but warped, almost a parody, echoing from somewhere deep in the trees. I avoided the old mining trails after that, but the forest had other plans. During a routine patrol near an abandoned ghost town nestled between ridges, I noticed the houses weren't as empty as the maps indicated. Windows blackened with grime held shadows that shifted when I looked away. Doors creaked open without wind. Rusted swings moved in the playground, though the air was still. I felt eyes on me, counting me, analyzing my movements, always one step ahead. I rationalized it. Drafty old buildings. My imagination. My mind clung to the explanation as a lifeline, even as my skin crawled. It wasn't until I found the first body that I realized the forest's patience was infinite, and its cruelty deliberate. A young man, gone for weeks, discovered in a hollowed-out cabin. His eyes were wide, unseeing, and his mouth open in a silent scream. The smell, burnt hair mixed with something metallic, was unbearable. I shouldn't have touched him, but instinct overrode caution. The second I brushed his arm, I felt the forest take notice of me personally, the way a predator notes the presence of prey that is aware, yet still vulnerable. I couldn't sleep for nights. Every shadow in my cabin seemed to pulse, breathing in tandem with my heartbeat. And then came the voices from beneath the earth. While investigating a frozen lake where another camper vanished months prior, I stood on the thin ice, flashlight cutting through the fog. The whispers weren't above ground. They came from below, from under the ice, carrying names and threats, moving in spirals I couldn't follow. The sound made the hair on my arms stand on end. I tried rationalizing air pockets, the ice cracking, but the voices called with my own brother's timber, long dead, repeating a question I could not answer. Sleep became impossible. Every night I would dream, or maybe remember, descending into tunnels that didn't exist, caves with walls pulsing like lungs, corridors echoing the cries of those who had vanished before me. The dreams felt like confessions, mine, theirs, the forest's. Sometimes I would wake to find my bed covered in footprints, wet soil, or a fine layer of ash that smelled faintly of iron. Once I awoke to find my own reflection in a tarnished metal plate on my wall, staring back at me with eyes that were not mine. I began recording everything obsessively, not for proof, but as a lifeline to my own sanity. I would write down names, locations, times, and the oddities, the smells, the sounds, the movement. Sometimes I would read them aloud, hoping the act of speaking would stabilize reality. It never did. The forest doesn't require belief to operate. It observes, catalogs, and remembers. My notes were pointless except as a shield against my own unraveling mind. It was on one of these patrols, following a map of an old military zone no longer in use, that I first saw it in full form, or at least what I think was full form. At first, it was just a silhouette, pale and impossibly tall, standing among the burned-out husks of barracks. I froze. My flashlight's beam flickered as if in protest. It didn't move toward me, didn't run, didn't even blink. It simply stood and watched, its posture human but not human, every gesture exaggerated yet eerily familiar. I could feel its gaze burn into me. I tried speaking. "Who? What are you?" My voice trembled, cracking halfway through. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The way it existed in the landscape, observing me without interaction, was proof enough that I was no longer alone. I backed away slowly, counting every step, aware of the faint vibrations in the ground beneath my boots. Something was tracking me, moving in tandem without sound. When I finally turned and ran, the silhouette dissolved like smoke, leaving only the faint metallic scent of decay and burnt hair. That night, I returned to my cabin, terrified but compelled to face it again. I left all lights on, windows open, doors locked, and yet I could hear it, the breathing, faint but deliberate, just outside. Shadows pooled under the walls, thickening, twisting, shifting into forms that weren't real. My rational mind screamed at me, ghosts, hallucinations, exhaustion. But the touch of cold on my shoulder, the almost imperceptible vibration in the floor, told me otherwise. The forest was alive, intelligent, patient, and perhaps even cruel for sport. I began to avoid humans. Fellow rangers, locals, campers, they could not see, could not feel what I did. Their lives continued as normal, untouched by the cataloging, the whispers, the reflections that did not match movement. I started walking patrols alone at night, avoiding the main roads, seeking places where the forest's memory was strongest. Mines, abandoned bunkers, ghost towns, frozen lakes, places where people disappeared without explanation. It was here in these locations that the forest reminded me of its patience and the inevitability of being watched. One night, following a series of caves rumored to hide old prospecting tunnels, I found a chamber sealed by stone slabs. The air smelled of sulfur and ash, thick and oppressive. I pressed my hand against the cold stone. The whispers came instantly, urgent now, almost pleading. They called names, Some mine, some I recognized from past disappearances, others entirely unfamiliar. The stone beneath my hand vibrated faintly, like a heartbeat. The forest was alive beneath the surface now, cataloging my fear in the same way it cataloged everything else. I turned to leave, but the exit seemed to have moved. The walls stretched impossibly, folding in angles that shouldn't exist. Shadows pooled and shifted, coalescing into forms I knew but could not name. One shape, tall, pale, like with an impossible symmetry, moved alongside me silently. My flashlight flickered and died. I could feel its presence brushing against my arm, a cold touch, soft yet impossible to ignore. I realized finally that the forest didn't hunt blindly. It didn't stalk. It observed, learned, and tested. It mimicked those it had seen, those it cataloged, using their faces, voices, and behaviors to lure others. And tonight I was both observer and prey. The air pulsed with expectation, heavy and watchful. Every footstep echoed into impossibility, and every shadow became a judge. I lost track of time in that chamber, hours, minutes, maybe days. It no longer mattered. The forest, the cave, the shadows, they had rewritten my understanding of space and duration. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, but the exit didn't exist where it should have. I pressed on, crawling through narrow passages that twisted impossibly, walls damp and slick against my palms. The whispers followed, louder now, intimate and accusatory, carrying the names of people I had failed to protect, people who had vanished under my watch. The deeper I went, the more the air changed. It was thick, metallic, and smelled of something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. Burnt hair mixed with decay, something animal yet intelligent. I stumbled over uneven stone and what felt disturbingly like bone fragments, though the shapes were unfamiliar, elongated, impossible. My flashlight, the last source of light I had, flickered intermittently, casting brief, sickly pale illumination across walls that seemed to breathe with every pulse of my fear. I tried to rationalize it. Hypothermia, stress, exhaustion. But my body knew better. I felt eyes on me constantly, even when I couldn't see anything. The shadows shifted independently, pooling in corners where no light reached. Once, I caught a movement in the periphery, a thin, elongated hand pressing briefly against the wall, leaving a faint smear, then gone. My rational mind screamed to retreat, but my curiosity and compulsion pushed me further. I had to know what the forest wanted from me, and then I heard it. Soft at first, almost gentle, like a lullaby sung underwater. The whispers grew into words, phrases, some familiar, some horrifyingly not. Dean, come closer. We remember you. We are all here. The voice wasn't human. It carried the tones of those I loved, those I failed, those I feared, all overlapping and impossible to separate. I stumbled forward, nausea turning my stomach, heart hammering in my chest like a drum of warning. The forest had become conscious, aware of me, and perhaps even anticipating my next thought before I had it. I entered a larger cavern, one that seemed intentionally concealed. The walls pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, and the shadows coalesced into forms I recognized from the memories cataloged in my mind. Campers, lost hikers, a ranger from a neighboring district who had vanished 6 months prior. They weren't alive, not in the conventional sense, but they were present. Watching, waiting. Their eyes glinted in the dim light, reflections not matching their bodies, their forms stretching impossibly as if the cave itself was mocking geometry and physics. I sank to my knees, hands pressed to my ears, trying to block the sound of the whispers. But the forest doesn't stop. It catalogs, it remembers, it punishes in subtle, intelligent ways. I could feel it learning my reactions, testing me, assessing whether I would survive or break. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, I understood that I wasn't just observed. I was being prepared. For what? I didn't know. But the pressure on my chest, the invisible hands brushing against my arms, and the oppressive smell of burnt hair told me it would not be pleasant. I crawled toward a smaller tunnel, almost instinctively, drawn by a faint light ahead. It was a soft glow, unnatural, illuminating a sealed doorway made of stone and rusted metal. The whispers changed tone here, urgent and sharp. Open it. Dean, you know you must. We've waited. My rational mind resisted, warning me that this was wrong, that nothing good could lie behind this door. But my body moved forward anyway, compelled by some combination of fear, curiosity, and obsession that I could no longer disentangle. I forced the door open, stones scraping against metal, a sound that echoed impossibly through the cavern. Inside was not a room, but a space that defied comprehension. The walls shimmered faintly, like liquid shadow, and the air vibrated with low-frequency pulses that seemed to resonate inside my skull. And there, at the center, was a shape that made me understand everything I feared about the forest. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that should not exist. Its skin reflected the faint light, pale and slick like oil. And yet it was not just a creature, it was the embodiment of observation, patience, and intelligence, waiting. I could feel it cataloging me, memorizing my reactions, my fears, my guilt, and then it moved. Not toward me, not yet, but shifting in ways that defied physics, that folding into shadows, disappearing and reappearing closer each time I blinked. The air grew hotter and colder in rapid succession. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. The whispers became more insistent, almost conversational now, mocking my attempts to rationalize. "You cannot leave. Dean, we know everything. You belong to us." I ran, or at least I thought I did. My legs moved, but the cavern stretched endlessly, twisting impossibly. Shadows lunged, not attacking, but forcing me to turn, to run deeper, to confront forms and faces I recognized from my past cases. The ground beneath my boots vibrated in sync with the pulse of the whispers, each step measured, calculated, a predator tracking prey that knows it is being hunted. I stumbled, scraping my hands across wet stone, tasting iron and ash. Something touched my shoulder again, cold, insistent, like it wanted me to understand something I couldn't name. And then I saw the final horror. A series of figures, human in silhouette but distorted, each one standing perfectly still as if frozen in time, lined along the walls of the chamber. Their heads tilted slightly toward me, eyes gleaming with a light that did not come from any natural source. One of them stepped forward, and in that instant, I understood. The forest doesn't just catalog memory. It replicates it, recreates it, and uses it against the living. The figure's lips moved, forming words I knew intimately, though I couldn't hear them clearly. "You belong to us, like them." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the pulsing walls. The shadows shifted again, folding over themselves, weaving in impossible patterns, and the chamber seemed to stretch into infinity. I ran blindly, every step echoing into the cavern like a warning. Yet somehow, I knew that nothing I did mattered. The forest was patient. It could wait. It had waited for centuries for someone like me, someone aware, someone observant, someone human enough to fear but not yet broken. I collapsed at the edge of a narrow shaft, leaning against walls slick with condensation, shivering violently despite the heat that seemed to radiate from the very stone. My breath came in ragged gasps, eyes darting, heart hammering. The whispers softened, intimate and cruel, promising inevitable contact, inevitable understanding. Soon. Dean. Soon. The cavern itself seemed to pulse in agreement, and I realized I had not yet reached the end of this nightmare. I had only entered its deeper layer. I don't remember how long I stayed in that chamber. Time ceased to exist, measured only by the pulse of the walls, the rhythm of whispers echoing from every shadow. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion became meaningless. My body had become a vessel of observation, cataloged by the forest and whatever consciousness lived within it. I tried to stand, tried to retrace my steps, but every tunnel seemed to shift, folding and stretching in ways my mind refused to comprehend. The shadows clung to me now, brushing my skin like wet silk, tugging, pulling, reminding me I was not in control. The deeper I went, the more I understood the forest's method. It doesn't hunt in the conventional sense. It waits, studies, learns. It folds your past, your regrets, and your memories into its environment, creating illusions indistinguishable from reality. I saw faces I had loved and lost, replayed with subtle differences. Some smiled, others screamed. Each reflected a version of myself I had long denied. Failures, cowardice, the inability to protect, and the whispers, never constant, always changing, forced me to hear truths I had buried, secrets that should have stayed hidden. I stumbled into a chamber that seemed deliberately constructed, a vault within the earth. The air was thick with sulfur and wet decay, and I could feel the faint tremor of something alive moving beneath the stone floor. Shapes writhed in the corners, so subtle that I questioned whether they existed or if my mind was fracturing entirely. I pressed my flashlight to the wall and caught fleeting glimpses, elongated limbs, faces with hollow eyes, mouths moving soundlessly. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding as if inhaling my terror. Then I found the markings, ancient scratches, carvings that predated the Forest Service, perhaps predated any human settlement, lines, spirals, and shapes that formed a language I could not read, but I understood their purpose instinctively: communication, warning, recording. Some carvings depicted figures, tall and thin, mimicking humans. Others showed groups disappearing into tunnels never to return. And one symbol resembled me. My face, roughly etched, eyes wide, mouth frozen in silent scream. The forest had waited for me long before I even arrived. A low vibration started in the stone beneath my knees, subtle at first, then intensifying, resonating through my bones. I heard the faint brush of air against skin that wasn't my own, whispering, "Dean, Dean, come closer." I tried to retreat, but the walls seemed to close in, guiding me forward, forcing me deeper into the cavern. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in blackness more complete than night. And then I saw it, or felt it. A presence, impossibly large, surrounding me without touching, observing without moving. It was patient, calculating, and I realized it had been waiting for my recognition, my fear, my acknowledgement of its power. My knees buckled. I crawled through the darkness, guided by intuition and terror. Every sound was amplified: the drip of water, the scuttle of some unseen creature, my own ragged breathing. The whispers turned to full sentences, each tailored to my failures, my guilt, my regrets. "You couldn't save her. You couldn't save them. You cannot save yourself." Names of people long gone, victims I had investigated, those I had failed, they all echoed in the walls, surrounding me in judgment. My rational mind struggled to hold, grasping at explanations, but my body knew the truth. I was trapped in something alive, conscious and patient beyond human comprehension. I stumbled into what appeared to be a sealed bunker, one that should not have existed in the heart of the mountain. The air was cold, unnatural, carrying the smell of metal, wet fur, and a hint of sulfur. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a chamber lined with shadows that moved independently of light. Figures stood motionless, pale, elongated, with faces too symmetrical to be human. One turned its head, tilting in perfect mimicry of my own motions, watching, waiting. The whispers converged here, louder, urgent, almost pleading. "We have waited. You belong. It is time." I tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself that exhaustion had fractured my mind irreparably, but the presence was undeniable, brushing against my shoulder, pressing against my chest, pulsating through the stone beneath me. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet escape seemed impossible. The shadows moved with intention, forming corridors that didn't exist before, leading me deeper into the bunker, into the memory of every disappearance, every scream, every unrecorded horror. Then came the sensation I feared most: recognition. The forest, the cavern, the shadows. They knew me intimately. They cataloged my past, my failures, my fears. Every movement I made was anticipated, every thought mirrored in the walls. And the thing at the center, whatever it was, mimicked life itself. It had studied humanity to perfection, understanding our weaknesses, our guilt, our need to reason. My mind flinched, desperate to hold on to logic, to cling to the explanation that this was all hallucination. But my body knew better. A shape emerged from the darkness, towering, impossibly thin, limbs bending in unnatural angles. Its face reflected the worst parts of everyone I had ever known, twisted into a grotesque familiarity. It didn't move closer, yet the air pressed against me as if it had. The whispers turned urgent, insistent, speaking words I could barely comprehend. "You are part of us. You always were. Dean, join." I screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the walls. My flashlight remained dead. Every step I took echoed endlessly. Every shadow twisted in ways my mind could not process. And then, without warning, I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The walls pulsed, shadows shifted, and the bunker stretched impossibly, folding space into angles I had no language to describe. I realized then that the forest, this place, whatever entity governed it, did not allow exits. Not in the way humans understand them. I sank to the floor, my hands pressed against the cold metal, trembling, tears running unchecked. The whispers softened, intimate and cruel, carrying names and faces that no longer belonged to the world above. Soon, Dean, you will see, you will understand. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying weight, pressure, intelligence. I understood something vital and horrifying. Whatever this was, it was patient. It had cataloged countless souls before me. It had waited, and it would wait again for anyone who dared intrude. I lay there, shaking, eyes darting, listening to whispers that were almost comforting in their cruelty. The forest had claimed me in memory, if not yet in body. And I knew that if I ever left this place, and I feared I might, it would never truly release me. Every glance, every shadow, every flicker of movement outside my field of vision would remind me that the cataloging was ongoing, that the patience of the wilderness was eternal, and its memory flawless. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, shaking, heart hammering in rhythm with the pulse of the walls. Eventually, instinct took over. I rose, every movement measured, every step calculated, even though the corridors ahead twisted impossibly, as if the bunker itself were a living entity intent on disorienting me. Shadows slid along walls, slipping around corners where no light could reach, and whispers trailed my every movement, carrying names, accusations, and promises I could not decipher fully. The deeper I went, the more surreal it became. Floors bent downward in ways my mind tried to reject, ceilings stretched impossibly high, dripping with condensation that smelled faintly of iron and charred flesh. Shapes lurked in corners, some vaguely humanoid, others not. One moved behind me, impossibly fast, brushing my shoulder before vanishing. My rational mind screamed that I was hallucinating, but the cold pressure, the invisible brush, the smell, burnt hair, sulfur, decay, told me otherwise. I stumbled into a cavern that seemed intentionally designed, a central chamber of this labyrinthine nightmare. The walls pulsed in rhythm with my fear, shadows coalescing into tall, thin forms with elongated limbs and impossibly symmetrical faces. Some mimicked my movements before I could make them, tilting their heads when I did, stepping in rhythm with my breaths. Their eyes, hollow, gleaming, locked onto me, and I felt their awareness probe every corner of my mind, cataloging my thoughts, my regrets, my guilt. I pressed forward, compelled by a mixture of fear and something darker, curiosity. The whispers intensified, now layered with familiar tones, friends, colleagues, family, twisted and warped, calling, pleading, mocking. Dean, Dean, you've always been ours. You see us. Names of missing hikers, campers, people I had investigated, all converged into an unbearable chorus that assaulted every sense. I stumbled, tripping over uneven stone, scraping my hands along the walls, tasting iron and ash. The figures did not advance, yet I could feel their presence, the weight of observation pressing in from all sides. And then I saw it, the core of the chamber. A massive shadow, taller than any human, limbs bent at impossible angles, skin pale, reflective, slick. It was both there and not there, folding in and out of perception, yet I could feel it cataloging me as surely as a predator catalogs prey. I wanted to scream, to run, to leave, but every instinct, every step forward was anticipated. The air pulsed, heat and cold alternating violently, pressing against my chest and making my lungs burn. The whispers spoke my name again, almost tenderly, yet laced with menace. You belong. Like them, I ran. Or perhaps I was pulled. The corridors shifted with every movement, walls stretching and folding, turning the act of fleeing into an exercise in futility. Figures followed silently, mimicking the gait of those who had vanished, faces familiar yet impossibly wrong, reflections of humanity warped into something alien. The vibrations beneath my feet, the soft brushing at my arms, the whispers, each pulse a reminder that escape was never the point. I was being prepared, taught, cataloged. I realized then the forest had no interest in killing immediately. It preferred observation, the slow erosion of understanding and sanity. Somewhere deep within this labyrinth, I stumbled into a chamber unlike the others. The air was thick, metallic, almost alive. Shapes writhed along the walls, too thin, too tall, too fluid to be human. Whispers converged into a singular voice, repeating my name, folding past, present, and possible futures together into a disorienting loop. I felt the presence of countless others before me, cataloged, studied, never leaving, trapped in memory. And I understood then, fully, irrevocably, the forest doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. It only observes, learns, and enacts patience beyond comprehension. I sank to the floor, knees pressed to my chest, trying to breathe, trying to ground myself in some semblance of logic. But the shadows pressed closer, not attacking, not speaking, only existing, aware, intelligent. A figure approached, taller than any human, limbs folding in ways my eyes couldn't follow. It mimicked me perfectly, step for step, tilt for tilt, breathing synchronized with my own. And then I saw the hand, long and impossibly thin, reach out, not to strike, but to touch, to test, to mark me. I felt the pressure against my chest, a cold and undeniable recognition that I was cataloged now, inseparable from the forest's memory. Panic set in. I ran again, blindly, corridors folding, ceilings dropping, floors tilting. Shadows followed relentlessly, imitating voices I once trusted, faces of people I loved twisted into grotesque familiarity. Every step echoed in the chamber like a verdict, every breath a confession. I realized that the forest doesn't need to harm you to control you. Memory, observation, and anticipation are enough. It can break your mind without leaving a scar, can trap you without touching. And I understood something worse. Some of the forms, some of the whispers were not just echoes. They were alive, waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to believe I could leave. Eventually, I found a narrow shaft, seemingly leading upwards. Instinct screamed to climb, to flee, to leave the horrors behind. I did, scrambling over slick stone, muscles trembling, heart hammering like a drum of warning. The whispers followed, insistent, intimate, repeating names, moments, failures. Every shadow in the shaft twisted toward me. Every corner seemed to stretch beyond logic. The presence, the intelligence, the patient observation of the forest pressed closer, a reminder that I had entered something that existed beyond human law or comprehension. At the top, I emerged into a small, dimly lit chamber, perhaps a remnant of a long-forgotten mine or a hidden underground facility. The air was thick with sulfur and wet earth, and the shadows here moved with terrifying purpose. Figures lined the walls, elongated, symmetrical, mimicking humanity but not human. One stepped forward, tilting its head in perfect synchronization with my own movement. The whispers converged into one voice, singular, commanding, and intimate. "Dean, you cannot leave. Not truly." I sank against the wall, tears running unchecked. I realized the forest, the shadows, the entity or entities cataloging me were not interested in death. They were interested in memory, in perfection, in patient observation. Every fear, every failure, every secret I carried was now part of them, folded into their awareness. I understood fully then that my life outside this place would never be the same. I would carry the cataloging with me, the shadows in my mind, the whispers in every corner, every reflection, every movement of light. And I knew one thing with horrifying clarity. Some doors, some shadows, some forests never let go. The chamber was silent for a moment, but the silence carried weight. It pressed down on my chest, heavier than stone, thicker than fear. I could feel the eyes of the shadows on me, following every tremor, every blink, every beat of my heart. The forest, the tunnels, the shadows, they had cataloged me completely. Every thought, every fear, every failure I had carried for years had been absorbed into their memory. I realized with a cold clarity that this was not a place I could leave intact. My body might escape, but my mind, my memory would remain. I moved forward through a narrow corridor that twisted impossibly, walls breathing with anticipation. Shapes shifted in corners, too tall, too thin, too fluid to be human. The air was thick with metallic scent, burnt hair, wet fur, decay, and sulfur mingling into a perfume of nightmare that made my stomach churn. I could hear whispers now without trying, words in the voices of those I loved and lost, mocking me, accusing me, urging me onward. Some of the forms moved in perfect mimicry, stepping as I stepped, tilting as I tilted, their awareness synchronizing with mine. At the end of the corridor, I found it. A chamber sealed with steel plates, older than I could comprehend, embedded into stone, carved with impossible symbols. The air radiated intelligence, consciousness, and patience. I pressed my hands against the metal, feeling the vibrations beneath it, the slow, deliberate pulse of the entity or entities, cataloging, waiting, learning. A whisper rose from beneath the surface, unmistakable now, soft but sharp, intimate and cruel. Dean, this is where it begins, and it never ends. The plates shuddered under my touch, and the shadows behind me convulsed, elongating, folding into themselves, and then reforming. I stumbled back, heart hammering, senses screaming. The air thickened, pressing down, shaping the cavern in ways my mind could barely comprehend. My flashlight was dead, my instincts screaming, but still I moved, drawn by a compulsion I could not resist. Something was waiting beyond the plates, something patient, something that had watched humanity for longer than any memory I possessed. I forced the door open. Beyond it lay a void, not empty, but full of movement, shadows, faces, reflections, echoes of every soul the forest had cataloged over centuries. Some were twisted, others near-perfect replicas of humanity. And there, in the center, stood the figure. Tall, impossibly thin, limbs folding in impossible angles, face a mirror of my own worst fears. It didn't move, but I could feel it observing, learning, and testing me. The whispers coalesced into one voice, repeating my failures, my guilt, my fears, threading through my mind like a needle. I collapsed, unable to move. The pressure on my chest intensified, shadows brushing against my skin, their presence undeniable, intelligent, deliberate. And then I understood fully. Escape was meaningless. The forest, the tunnels, the shadows, they didn't hunt. They waited, they observed, they cataloged. And I was now a part of that catalog, a recorded memory, a subject of patient observation, forever entwined with the wilderness that had claimed me. I tried to speak, but my voice was swallowed instantly. The whispers enveloped me, forming words I could not refuse. Dean. Part of us, always part of us. The chamber pulsed, the shadows folded and twisted, the walls breathed, and the air itself pressed with awareness. I realized then that I would never leave. Not truly. My body might emerge someday, but my mind, my memory, my very identity belonged to this place. The cataloging was complete. I was observed, and observation is eternal. Hours, maybe days passed, or perhaps only moments. Time had no meaning here. The whispers receded slightly, but their presence remained, coiled around my thoughts, embedding in my memories. Every shadow beyond the plates, every reflection in water or metal, every brush of wind through pine needles in the world above would be a reminder. I would never be free. The forest had claimed me in every sense that mattered. And so I write this confession now, not for proof, not for understanding, but as a warning. Whoever reads this, whoever wanders into the wilderness seeking solitude or adventure, know this. The forest remembers. It watches. It catalogs. Some disappearances are not accidents. Some things mimic humans to lure others. Some shadows only move when no one is watching, but they always watch. And even if you leave, even if you survive, you are never truly free. I am Dean. I was a forest ranger, and the shadows moved even when my light was off. The first time I felt the forest watching me, I was 19, and the weight of my own confidence was heavier than the pack on my back. I had grown up on the edge of the Cascade Range, in a small town where every family knew everyone else's secrets. And the mountains were both a playground and a warning. My father had been a ranger before me, and I inherited not only his uniform, but also his stubborn belief that the woods could be read like a map. Trails, animal tracks, the rhythm of wind through pine. But that certainty doesn't last. The forest doesn't read the way we do, and it doesn't forgive arrogance. My first summer as a ranger, I patrolled an area of the forest that had long been avoided even by the locals. It was a narrow valley between two steep ridges, where mist settled in the morning like a slow-moving river. People whispered about things in the trees at night, and I laughed it off, as you do when youth still feels invincible. The ranger station I reported to was a weathered wooden cabin perched on a ridge, with cracked windows that rattled in every storm, and a radio that occasionally flickered to life, with voices from far off, static bleating between them. The first strange event came on a clear morning. I was checking a trail that led to an old logging camp, now overgrown with alder and moss. The air smelled sharp with sap and earth. I remember stepping over a fallen log and hearing my own name, soft, drawn out, whispered in the exact tone I use when calling myself to attention. I froze. The wind was still. The trees didn't stir. I told myself it was my own voice bouncing back from a hollow somewhere, but something in the air vibrated with a tension I couldn't shake. Later, at the edge of the clearing, I saw tracks, too large for a human, too precise for a deer. They led to the edge of a small cave that locals avoided. I peered inside with my flashlight, the beam trembling slightly in my hands. The walls were damp and covered in lichen. I thought I saw movement deep in the shadows, just a flicker, the edge of something that didn't belong. My heart raced, but I rationalized it. Perhaps a bear, a mountain lion, something natural. I marked the site in my notes, telling myself I was cautious, experienced, rational. Yet that night, lying in the cabin, the whispers returned, quieter this time, a subtle mimicry of my breathing, my restless sighs. The forest had shifted around me without warning. Birds that had filled the morning with sound fell silent. Streams gurgled differently, almost hesitant, as if the water itself paused to listen. I began to notice patterns. Broken branches where no wind had touched, shadows at the edge of my vision that vanished when I turned. I told myself it was fatigue, the isolation getting to me. But there was a part of me, the instinct I had learned from years of tracking animals, that knew better. Something was learning me, waiting for the right moment to push past the veil of what I considered real. Weeks passed and the experiences escalated. A camper reported seeing a large, shadowy figure near a ridge late at night. I responded, driving my truck along the winding path with headlights cutting through fog. I found no one, only footprints in the dirt that disappeared abruptly at the edge of a cliff. My radio crackled, faint static whispers that resembled speech, always too indistinct to understand, yet unsettlingly intimate, as if someone or something knew my doubts and used them as a weapon. One evening, I walked the trail alone after a late report of missing hikers. The sun was gone, leaving a heavy indigo twilight, and the forest exhaled a damp chill. I paused near a small creek, listening to the water, when I heard it clearly for the first time. My own name, sharp and deliberate, carried through the trees in a voice identical to mine. My hands shook, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I called back, half laughing to cover my terror, and the echo returned, but warped, dragging my name across the rocks and leaves like it was tasting each syllable before letting it go. I ran. Not the measured pace of a trained ranger, but a blind, desperate dash, heart hammering against ribs as if it could break free. Behind me, branches snapped in a rhythm that was almost conversational, deliberate. I reached the cabin, slammed the door, locked it, and sat against the wall, panting, unable to reconcile the logic I clung to with what had just happened. I tried to sleep, tried to convince myself that exhaustion and the forest's eerie acoustics explained it. But when I finally closed my eyes, I heard the whisper again, unmistakable, right at the edge of my ear. My own name, exactly as I had said it, followed by a cold, elongated pause. The next weeks blurred. I began taking extra precautions, double-checking trails, avoiding areas near the cave, even skipping sections of patrol where I felt the air heavy or unnatural. Yet, the forest didn't respond to logic. The shadows deepened. The sounds multiplied. One morning, I discovered something new. Scratches along the side of the ranger station, vertical and deep, as though the wood itself had been clawed by something enormous. I checked the cameras installed outside the building, but the footage showed nothing, only the swaying of trees in an invisible wind. I realized then that my usual methods, the tracking, the notes, the maps, offered no safety. The rules of the forest I thought I knew had changed, and I had no choice but to learn them anew. It was during a particularly cold snap, when frost coated every branch like shattered glass, that I faced the entity directly. I was following a faint trail near the ridge when I glimpsed a figure in the trees. Too tall to be a man, covered in dark hair, with limbs that moved with both unnatural slowness and sudden bursts of speed. My flashlight trembled as I raised it, illuminating nothing for a moment, then catching the eyes, bright, reflective, intelligent, and horrifyingly aware of me. I froze. Every survival instinct screamed to run, yet my feet remained rooted to the earth. The creature tilted its head, cocked as though curious, and I felt an almost human intelligence behind its gaze, calculating, patient, waiting. It spoke then, not in words, but in sound, a guttural, rolling mimicry of my own voice, repeating my thoughts aloud. Every fear I had buried, the doubts about my competence, the guilt over past mistakes, the terror of losing control, was voiced back at me. I staggered backward, heart thudding in my throat, and stumbled over roots, landing hard on the frozen ground. The figure didn't chase, it simply watched, a shadow among shadows. But the echo of my own internal fears, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine, yet somehow mine, left me shaken to the core. I spent the night huddled against a tree, wrapped in my coat, unable to sleep. I knew then that the forest was not merely a setting, but an adversary, a living organism capable of psychological precision. I realized my survival depended not on weapons or maps, but on understanding, respecting, and, strangely, acknowledging fear rather than suppressing it. The forest forced confrontation with my own vulnerabilities, and in doing so, it revealed truths I had ignored. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face the unknown, to listen, and to adapt. The weeks following that encounter became a study of patience and observation. I learned to distinguish between natural and unnatural sounds, the subtle differences in footprints, the patterns of shadow and mist. I marked safe routes and memorized hiding spots, developing a silent dialogue with the terrain. And yet, every so often, I would hear it again, the whisper of my name, just enough to remind me that understanding the forest was not mastery, and that some presences defy logic entirely. The final incident occurred near the old cave. The missing hikers had been found long before, their disappearance unrelated, yet the air around the cave pulsed with a weight that made breathing difficult. I approached cautiously, every sense alert. As I neared the mouth of the cave, I felt the temperature drop sharply, a windless chill that pressed against my skin and carried a faint, musky scent, like wet fur and earth. Inside, I saw the silhouette again, larger now, almost filling the entrance, immobile yet impossibly present. I spoke my name aloud, testing myself, and the echo returned, but twisted, almost affectionate, like recognition. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the cave, knowing that leaving might be the safest option, yet feeling compelled to acknowledge it. I realized then that fear and respect are not opposites, they coexist, and that in the forest, in this vast, untamed cathedral of trees, rivers, and stone, one must constantly negotiate with the unknown, not dominate it. Eventually, I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the cave, and retreated to the ranger station. That night, lying in bed, I finally understood. The forest had not sought to harm me, but to teach me, to force me into a confrontation with my own fragility, my own assumptions, my own voice. And in doing so, it had shaped me into a ranger who no longer simply patrolled trails, but listened to them, who no longer dismissed whispers as coincidence, but heard them as a dialogue with the living, breathing wilderness. Even now, years later, I walk those paths with caution, but also with reverence. Every snap of a branch, every distant echo, every mist that curls through the trees reminds me that the forest is alive in ways beyond human comprehension. And sometimes, when the night is still, I hear it again, a whisper, a voice, mine and not mine, calling me to remember that the unknown is neither friend nor foe, but teacher. Something whispered my name with my own voice, and in that moment I understood what it meant to truly listen. After that night, the whispers never stopped, though they changed. They were no longer just my name. They began to echo fragments of my thoughts, my regrets, the things I had tried to bury. Walking along the old trails, I would catch myself thinking a simple question: am I safe? And then hear it answered in the same voice I carried in my head, but warped, stretched, almost taunting. The forest seemed to lean closer when I paused, as if it hungered for my hesitation, for the moments when doubt crept in and threatened to unravel my carefully maintained composure. One evening, I responded to a report of missing hikers near the upper ridge. The night was thick with fog, each step of my boots muffled, each branch tapping like a metronome, counting down to something I could not yet name. My flashlight cut swaths of white through the gray, illuminating nothing but twisted tree roots and the occasional glimmer of frost. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sigh coming from the ridge above me. It wasn't human, not fully, yet somehow familiar. My own heartbeat seemed to sync with it, an unbidden rhythm that drew me forward despite the unease coiling in my stomach. I followed the sound, creeping along the narrow path, when a shadow moved across the trees ahead. At first, I thought it was another ranger, or perhaps a hiker who had gotten lost, but the movement was fluid in a way no human could manage. It leapt from tree to tree, almost floating, and then froze, staring at me with eyes that reflected the weak beam of my flashlight like mirrors. I could feel it studying me, evaluating my fear. My hands went clammy. The rational part of my mind screamed to retreat, but another part, curiosity, stubbornness, pride, forced me to step closer. The shadow descended toward the trail, slow and deliberate until I could see it fully. It was tall, impossibly so, with shoulders that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its hair was dark, matted, almost wet, and its face, well, I will never forget its face. It was elongated, with a mouth that seemed too wide to be human, and eyes that held not malice, but a piercing, uncanny intelligence. And then it spoke, or at least it projected sound into my mind, not aloud. The words weren't coherent in any language, yet I understood them. My deepest fears whispered back at me, amplified, dissected. I staggered backward, tripping over roots and landing hard on my side. The creature did not advance further. It simply watched, and the forest itself seemed to lean in closer, pressing against me from all sides. The wind had died. The usual night chorus of owls and rustling leaves had gone silent. Only my breath and the sound of my own panic filled the air. And then I heard it, my own voice again, coming from the shadows behind me, repeating the word run, but slower, elongated, dragging the fear out until it seemed endless. I bolted. The trail twisted and narrowed. Every step brought a new obstacle: fallen trees, jagged rocks, slick moss that threatened to send me sprawling. I could hear branches snapping around me, but not in a chaotic way. They moved as if guided by intention, like the forest itself was shaping my path, corralling me. My flashlight swung wildly, catching glimpses of massive shapes that dissolved when I looked directly. I felt as if I were running through some living nightmare, one carefully orchestrated to force every ounce of my attention and fear into sharp focus. I reached the ranger station hours later, soaked with sweat despite the cold, shivering violently. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, and pressed my back against the wall. My chest heaved, my eyes scanned every shadow in the room, half expecting it to be there, waiting. The whispers didn't come immediately, but when they returned, they were subtle, a faint repetition of my thoughts, my own voice slightly off, distorted, as if mocking me. I understood then that this presence did not need to chase me. It could exist in the periphery, in the mind, in the very way I perceived the world, and that made it infinitely more terrifying. Days later, I tried to rationalize it, to apply the skills I had learned as a ranger. I checked for human tracks, for large animal prints, for any evidence that could explain the impossibility of what I had seen. There was none. Just broken branches and the faintest impressions in the dirt that seemed too deep for a man, yet too precise for a wild creature. I started carrying a notebook, sketching patterns, mapping the terrain with obsessive precision, trying to impose order on chaos. But the forest resisted. Every mark I made, every path I drew, seemed to shift subtly the next day, as if mocking the idea that I could ever truly understand it. It wasn't long before the phenomenon escalated again. I received another report. Campers hearing voices in the night, footsteps outside their tents, items moved mysteriously. I drove to the location, alone, headlights piercing through the thick darkness. The campers' tents were intact, no signs of struggle, but there was a strange, heavy silence in the air, one that seemed to weigh on my chest. I walked among the tents, calling out for anyone who might be there, and that's when I heard it, my voice, coming from a tent, whispering my own name, asking questions I hadn't spoken aloud, repeating private thoughts I hadn't shared with a single soul. I froze, heart hammering. The air itself seemed to pulse around me, the fog curling like fingers. My instincts screamed to leave, yet I felt an unshakable pull toward the tent. I approached slowly, every sense straining, every muscle coiled for flight. As I drew near, a sound behind me made me spin, something massive stepping lightly over debris, following me. I shone the flashlight, catching nothing but the shifting fog. I realized then that it didn't need to be seen to be present. It existed in the perception of the forest, in the sound of the wind, in the faint echoes of my own mind. By the time I returned to the ranger station that night, my mind was fraying. Sleep was impossible. The whispers followed me even there, subtle but insistent. I began to question my own memories, my own perceptions. Had I imagined the creature, or was it real? And if real, what did it want? I felt myself slipping into the territory of pure instinct, the part of a ranger that operates on gut and experience, stripped of logic. Fear had become my companion, teaching me lessons in ways I could not fully articulate. Weeks turned into months, and I began to adapt, not by confronting the entity directly, but by learning its rhythms, its patterns, the way it interacted with the forest. I stopped running immediately at the first whisper. I learned to listen, to interpret, to respect the presence without provoking it. I realized the fear itself was a teacher. Each heartbeat, each frozen moment, each echo of my own voice returning altered, forced me to confront what it truly meant to exist in a wild place, alone, against something that defied reason. One night, during a particularly long patrol, I found myself near the old cave again. The fog rolled in thick and suffocating, the air carrying that same earthy, musky scent. I paused, flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the mist, and felt the presence before I saw it, a heavy, intelligent silence, an awareness that weighed against my chest. I called out my own name, a test, and the response came, slow and deliberate, drawn from the shadows. My voice, yet distorted, intimate, aware of every fear I had. I stood there, frozen, recognizing that I could not outrun this. There was no escape, only confrontation and acknowledgement. Slowly, I spoke aloud what I felt. My doubt, my fear, my humanity, every fragment of my mind that had been dissected and mirrored back at me. And for a long moment, the forest and the presence within it listened. The wind softened, the fog shifted, and I felt an almost palpable recognition, as if the forest had accepted that I was no longer merely an intruder or a novice, but a participant in its rhythm, capable of both fear and respect. That night, I walked back to the station differently. My steps were deliberate, calm, yet vigilant. I knew the whispers would not stop, the presence would not vanish, and the forest would continue its lessons. But I also knew that fear, properly faced and understood, did not cripple, it refined. The creature, the voice, the cave, the shadows, they were not simply threats, they were mirrors, revealing truths about my mind, my instincts, my courage, my fragility. Even now, every patrol brings reminders. A rustle in the trees, the faintest shift of mist, a whisper at the edge of perception. I have learned to walk with them, to listen, to acknowledge that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only respected. And when I hear it again, my own name carried through the night, warped and elongated, familiar and alien, I remind myself that the forest is alive, and that true courage is not in denying fear, but in walking through it, fully aware, fully present, fully human. Months passed, and the forest had become both a mentor and a mirror. I no longer felt the unshakable panic I once did when my name echoed through the trees or when shadows moved with impossible fluidity. The fear was still there, never gone, but it had transformed into a presence I could recognize, measure, and respect. I had learned to move deliberately, to listen before acting, to weigh instinct against logic, and above all, to honor the boundaries of the wild. Yet nothing could prepare me for the night when I understood the full measure of the forest's will and the depth of my own vulnerability. It began with a call from a ranger colleague. A fire lookout tower on the far side of the ridge had reported strange sounds, lights moving among the trees in ways that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. I drove the winding forest roads alone, headlights cutting through the fog like twin knives. The forest smelled damp, metallic, and ancient. Every tree I passed seemed to lean inward, casting long, skeletal shadows that crawled along the roadside. I felt eyes on me, more than human, more than animal, watching every turn, every hesitation. By the time I reached the tower, night had swallowed the ridge. The lookout reported nothing more than strange noises, a low hum that vibrated through the air, punctuated by what sounded like a voice repeating my name, echoing faintly, carried by the wind. I stayed at the tower, restless, scanning the forest with binoculars, when I saw movement. Something huge, darker than the night, moved just beyond the tree line, slinking between trees with a stealth that no animal could manage. My heart thudded, but I forced myself to remain calm, grounding myself with the lessons the forest had forced me to learn. Observation first, panic later. Then it came closer. The shape emerged fully into a small clearing illuminated by moonlight. I froze, flashlight slipping from my hand, eyes widening as I saw it. The creature, taller and more terrifying than ever, limbs long and coiled with sinewy strength, eyes glinting with intelligence. Its hair hung in matted clumps, dripping with dew or something darker, the smell of earth and wet fur overwhelming. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that filled my mind, a direct echo of every thought I had tried to conceal, a mirror of my fears, doubts, and regrets. My own thoughts became audible, twisted, amplified, and I understood with a horrifying clarity that the forest itself was using this presence to strip away the illusions I had clung to. I backed slowly, instinct screaming to flee, yet some part of me, the trained ranger, the man who had learned to survive by reading the forest, told me to stand, to observe, to endure. The creature tilted its head, listening, and then began to advance. Each step it took did not break the undergrowth, did not disturb the leaves. It moved in deliberate silence, a predator and teacher at once. And as it approached, the whisper came again. My name, stretched across the clearing, elongated, intimate, aware. But this time it was not just fear. It carried a challenge, a lesson embedded in the terror. I raised my flashlight, hand trembling, and shone it directly at the figure. Its eyes reflected the beam like mirrors, and I realized the truth. The creature was not merely an external threat. It was an extension of the forest's will, a manifestation of its memory, of its awareness, of the way it forces those who enter to confront themselves. I felt every moment of hesitation, every lapse in courage laid bare before me, and I knew that my survival depended not on strength or speed, but on acknowledgement. Fear was not weakness, it was clarity. I spoke aloud, my voice cracking at first, then steadier, recounting what I felt, the exhaustion of solitude, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge of my own mortality. I admitted my doubts, my guilt, my human fragility. The creature paused, and the forest itself seemed to exhale, the wind picking up gently, carrying away the tension like smoke. The whispers softened, no longer mocking, but echoing my voice back in a rhythm that felt almost reverent. I took a step forward, then another. until I stood at the edge of the clearing, fully exposed, not hiding, not fleeing. Then it vanished. One moment it loomed before me, a shadow against the trees. The next, it was gone, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the faint, lingering scent of earth and fur. I stayed in the clearing for hours, silent, listening, heart-pounding, feeling the residual energy of the encounter settle into the soil, the trees, the fog. I realized then that the forest had not been punishing me, nor had it been trying to harm me. It had been guiding me, shaping me, revealing the depths of my own mind, forcing me to confront the fragility of reason, the weight of courage, the necessity of respect for forces beyond understanding. Returning to the ranger station, I felt different. Not stronger, not invincible, but profoundly aware of my own limitations, my own humanity. Each patrol thereafter carried that awareness. Every whisper of the wind, every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow at the edge of vision reminded me that the forest is alive, not just with wildlife, but with the accumulated memory of every ranger, every camper, every secret buried in the soil. And sometimes, when I am alone in the mist, I hear it again, my own name, whispered with a voice that is mine, and yet entirely other, calling me to remember. It is a humbling existence, to walk through a wilderness that watches, that learns, that judges, and that teaches. Fear has become my compass, guiding me through moments when reason falters, when instinct screams, when the unknown presses against my skin like a living thing. I have learned to listen, to honor, to move with intention, and to accept that some lessons are earned through confrontation, through facing what cannot be explained, through standing in a clearing at night, staring into the darkness, and acknowledging the presence that exists beyond comprehension. The forest is patient. It waits for those who think themselves untouchable. It whispers names, repeats thoughts, twists shadows, and tests courage. It teaches that reason is fragile, that the mind is a labyrinth, and that the unknown is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a mirror to be understood. I have learned to walk with it, to respect it, to fear it without being enslaved by that fear. And in doing so, I have discovered something profoundly human. That courage is not the absence of terror, but the willingness to stand in it, to listen, to acknowledge the shadows, and to carry on, even when every step is haunted by the whisper of your own name. I am a park ranger, yes, but not merely a guardian of trails and trees. I am a student of the forest, a witness to its intelligence, its memory, and its dark, intimate wisdom. I have faced the presence that lurks beyond understanding, and though it continues to whisper, continues to challenge, I have emerged not broken, but aware. And in that awareness lies a strange, enduring peace. The forest has taught me that fear, properly faced, is the most honest teacher, and that the unknown, no matter how terrifying, carries lessons that cannot be learned in daylight. Sometimes when the night is still and the mist curls low along the ground, I pause and listen. A branch snaps softly in the distance. The wind shifts, and I hear it. My own voice whispered back at me, calling, reminding, urging. I do not run, I do not tremble. I breathe, I acknowledge, and I walk forward, fully alive, fully present, fully human. Because the forest has shown me that survival is not only about enduring what lies outside, but also about facing what lives inside. And in that confrontation, I have discovered the fragile, luminous thread of courage that connects us all to the land, to each other, and to the whispering shadows that teach us who we truly are.